The museum, at this hour, appears to exist outside of time, suspended in a quiet that feels both complete and deliberate, as if nothing within it is unfinished and nothing requires adjustment, presenting itself as a space that invites observation, without resistance, where objects seem to wait patiently to be seen, to be understood, to be contemplated at a distance that feels neutral and unforced. The absence of movement creates the impression that nothing is directing attention, that the viewer moves freely through the space, selecting what to look at and how long to remain, believing that the act of seeing originates entirely from within, guided by personal interest, curiosity, or intuition. This sense of autonomy is reinforced by the stillness of the environment, by the careful arrangement of light that does not call attention to itself, and by the spacing of objects that suggests openness rather than constraint, allowing the viewer to experience the museum as a place where perception unfolds naturally, without interference, without pressure, and without structure. Yet this impression of neutrality begins to shift when attention lingers, when the act of looking extends beyond the immediate surface of things, and when the viewer becomes aware that certain elements appear more readily than others, that some works draw the eye with greater force, and that movement through the space follows a pattern that feels consistent rather than random, revealing that what initially seemed like freedom is in fact a condition shaped by relations that are not immediately visible. The eye does not wander without direction, but is guided along paths that have been carefully constructed, moving from one point of focus to another in a sequence that feels coherent, suggesting that perception is not merely a response to what is present, but an engagement with a system that organizes what can be seen, and how it can be seen. The viewer, while believing themselves to be independent, begins to recognize that their attention aligns with structures that exist prior to their arrival, indicating that the experience of seeing is not entirely self-determined, but is shaped by conditions embedded within the environment. This realization does not arise as a disruption, but as a gradual recognition emerging from the accumulation of small observations that, when considered together, reveal a pattern that cannot be dismissed as coincidence, suggesting that the museum is not a passive container, but an active system that organizes perception through the arrangement of space, the positioning of objects, and the control of light and scale, the distance between works, the height at which they are displayed, the direction from which they are approached, and the sequence in which they appear all contribute to an experience that feels continuous and coherent, indicating that the viewer's movement is not arbitrary but anticipated, that attention is not scattered but directed, and that perception unfolds within a framework that remains largely invisible. The stability of this framework allows it to operate without drawing attention to itself, ensuring that the viewer experiences guidance without recognizing it as such, maintaining the illusion that the act of seeing remains entirely their own. Within this system, the objects themselves participate in the organization of perception, as their forms, proportions, and internal structures guide the eye in ways that extend beyond their immediate presence, creating lines of attention that connect one element to another, shaping how the image is read and how meaning is constructed. The viewer does not simply observe the object, but enters into a relationship with it, in which the act of seeing is influenced by the arrangement of the parts within the whole, revealing that composition is not merely an aesthetic choice, but a mechanism that directs perception. The balance of forms, the alignment of axes, and the distribution of visual weight create conditions in which certain elements appear more significant, more stable, or more central, guiding the viewer toward interpretations that feel natural and self-evident, even though they are the result of deliberate construction. The image, therefore, does not present itself as neutral, but as a system that organizes attention, ensuring that perception follows a path that aligns with its internal logic. This logic extends beyond individual objects to encompass the space in which they are encountered, revealing that architecture itself participates in the construction of perception, shaping how the viewer moves where they pause, and how they orient themselves within the environment. The arrangement of corridors, the placement of entrances and exits, and the alignment of walls and openings create a structure that guides movement in ways that feel intuitive, suggesting that the viewer's path is chosen freely, even as it follows a trajectory that has been carefully designed. The relationship between the body and the space becomes central to this experience, as the scale of the environment, the height of ceilings, and the proportions of rooms influence how the viewer perceives themselves in relation to what surrounds them, creating a sense of stability or disorientation, openness or enclosure, depending on how these elements are calibrated. The body does not move through space independently, but responds to conditions that shape its orientation, revealing that movement itself is structured, that the act of walking is guided, and that perception unfolds within a field that has been organized to produce coherence. The awareness of this organization transforms the experience of the museum as the viewer begins to recognize that what appears to be natural is in fact constructed, that what feels immediate is the result of relations that have been arranged to produce clarity, and that what seems neutral is the product of decisions that shape how the world is encountered. This recognition does not diminish the experience, but deepens it, revealing that the act of seeing is not passive, but active, not isolated, but relational, and not free from structure, but dependent on it. The viewer becomes aware that perception is not simply a matter of receiving information, but of engaging with systems that determine what can be seen, how it is seen, and how it is understood, suggesting that the experience of art is not confined to the objects themselves, but extends to the conditions that make their perception possible. The museum, in this sense, does not merely contain art, but reveals the mechanisms through which perception is organized, offering a space in which the structures that guide seeing can be encountered, examined, and understood. The stillness of the environment allows these structures to become more apparent, as the absence of distraction makes it possible to notice the patterns that shape attention, the alignments that guide movement, and the relations that produce coherence. The viewer, by remaining within this space, begins to perceive not only the objects, but the systems that organize them, recognizing that the act of seeing is not independent of these systems, but is formed through them, suggesting that perception itself is constructed, that it operates within conditions that remain largely invisible, and that the experience of art is inseparable from the structures that make it possible. As the museum prepares to open, as the quiet begins to give way to the presence of others, and as the stillness that allowed these patterns to emerge becomes less complete, the recognition of these structures does not disappear, but remains, altering how the viewer encounters the space, how they move through it, and how they see what is before them. The return of movement does not restore neutrality, but reveals that it never existed, that the conditions that shape perception were always present, and that the experience of seeing has always been guided by relations that extend beyond the individual. The viewer, having become aware of these relations, does not simply return to the world as it was, but carries with them a different understanding of perception, one in which seeing is recognized as an engagement with systems that shape how the world appears, ensuring that what has been encountered within the museum continues to influence how the world is seen beyond it, revealing that the act of looking is never entirely free, and that what appears before the eye is always in some way already structured. The act of seeing is often assumed to be immediate, natural, and unmediated, as if the eye functions as a transparent conduit through which the world presents itself directly to the mind, allowing objects to appear in their fullness without distortion, interpretation, or constraint, creating the impression that perception originates entirely within the individual and operates independently of external structures. This assumption persists because the mechanisms that shape perception remain largely invisible, embedded within habits of looking that have been acquired over time and internalized to such a degree that they no longer appear as learned behaviors, but as inherent capacities, leading the viewer to believe that what is seen is simply what is there, and that the act of seeing reflects an objective encounter with reality, rather than an engagement with systems that organize how that reality is perceived. The stability of this belief depends on the concealment of the processes that guide perception, ensuring that the viewer experiences their own vision as autonomous, even as it aligns with conventions that determine what is recognized, what is ignored, and how meaning is constructed from visual information. This concealment is not incidental but structural, as the effectiveness of perceptual systems depends on their capacity to operate without interruption, producing coherence without revealing the operations that sustain it, thereby maintaining the illusion that perception is direct rather than mediated. This understanding of perception as constructed rather than given finds its foundation in the recognition that the eye does not operate in isolation, but functions within a network of cultural, historical, and cognitive conditions that shape how visual information is processed and interpreted, suggesting that seeing is not a passive reception of stimuli, but an active process that depends on prior knowledge, learned expectations, and shared frameworks of interpretation. The work of Ernst Gombrich articulates this condition with particular clarity, demonstrating that perception relies on what he describes as schemata, internalized models that allow the viewer to organize visual input into recognizable forms, revealing that what is seen is always filtered through structures that precede the act of observation. These schemata are not fixed, but evolve through processes of correction and adjustment, in which expectations are continuously modified in response to visual experience, producing a dynamic interaction between what is anticipated and what is encountered. The viewer does not approach an image as a blank surface, but as a participant in a system that supplies interpretive tools, ensuring that perception operates through comparison rather than direct apprehension, and that recognition emerges through alignment between incoming stimuli and pre-existing frameworks. The historical dimension of these conditions becomes evident when one considers the variability of perception across different periods, revealing that what is immediately legible in one context may appear obscure or unintelligible in another, suggesting that the eye is trained to recognize specific forms of organization that are not universal but contingent upon cultural and historical circumstances. The analysis offered by Michael Baxandall develops this idea through the concept of the period eye, which describes the ways in which visual skills, interpretive habits, and perceptual expectations are shaped by the practices and material conditions of a particular time, indicating that perception is inseparable from social experience. The ability to interpret Renaissance images, for example, depends on familiarity with systems of measurement, mercantile calculation, religious narrative, and rhetorical training, suggesting that visual comprehension is embedded within broader cultural competencies. The viewer who encounters such images without these competencies does not lack vision, but lacks access to the frameworks that render the image intelligible, demonstrating that perception is conditioned by historically specific forms of knowledge that structure how visual information is organized and understood. This relationship between perception and knowledge is further elaborated through the work of Erwin Panofsky, whose formulation of perspective as a symbolic form reveals that systems of representation encode conceptual structures that extend beyond visual appearance, aligning perception with broader epistemological models. Perspective, in this account, is not a neutral technique, but a manifestation of a worldview in which space is conceived as homogeneous, continuous, and measurable, reflecting a conception of reality grounded in rational order. The viewer, positioned within this system, adopts a mode of seeing that corresponds to its logic, interpreting visual cues according to principles that define how space is constructed, indicating that perception is shaped by intellectual frameworks that determine how the world is understood. The alignment between representation and worldview ensures that the image appears coherent and natural, even as it reflects a historically specific conception of reality, demonstrating that what is perceived as natural vision is often the result of cultural and conceptual conditioning. The structuring of perception can also be understood through the analysis of Michel Foucault, who situates vision within regimes of knowledge that define what can be seen, said, and understood within a given historical moment, suggesting that visibility itself is governed by systems that regulate the field of perception. In this framework, the viewer does not encounter images as isolated objects, but within a network of discursive practices that determine their meaning and significance, ensuring that perception aligns with structures of knowledge that extend beyond individual experience. The organization of the museum exemplifies this condition, as objects are arranged according to categories that reflect historical narratives and conceptual frameworks, guiding the viewer's understanding through spatial and visual ordering, indicating that perception is shaped not only by the formal properties of images, but by the institutional contexts in which they are presented. The cognitive dimension of perception reinforces this structured condition, as the processes through which visual information is organized involve mechanisms that seek coherence, stability, and balance, shaping how patterns are recognized and interpreted. The work of Rudolf Arnheim demonstrates that perception operates through principles of organization that determine how elements relate to one another within the visual field, producing a sense of order that allows images to be understood as coherent wholes. These principles guide the viewer's attention, directing the eye towards certain elements while subordinating others, creating hierarchies that influence interpretation and meaning. The viewer does not passively receive visual information, but actively organizes it, constructing relationships that reflect both cognitive tendencies and the structural properties of the image, indicating that perception emerges from the interaction between internal processes and external arrangements. The acquisition of visual knowledge operates at multiple levels, encompassing not only the recognition of forms, but also the interpretation of meaning, as the viewer learns to associate specific visual elements with symbolic, narrative, and conceptual functions, allowing images to communicate beyond their immediate appearance. The work of A.B. Warburg introduces a further dimension to this process through the concept of cultural memory, suggesting that images carry traces of past meanings that persist and reappear across time, shaping how they are perceived and understood. The viewer, encountering such images, engages with layers of significance that extend beyond the present moment, indicating that perception is informed by historical continuities that influence interpretation. These associations are reinforced through repetition and transmission, ensuring that certain patterns of meaning become stable and widely shared, producing a sense of immediacy that obscures the processes through which these meanings are constructed. The role of art within this system extends beyond reflecting existing modes of perception to actively shaping them, providing models that influence how viewers learn to see and what they come to expect from visual experience. The introduction of linear perspective, the development of compositional strategies, and the manipulation of light and scale all contribute to the formation of perceptual habits that define how images are encountered, indicating that art functions as an instrument of perception as much as an object of observation. The viewer, engaging with these systems, internalizes their logic, allowing them to be applied beyond the context of art, shaping how the world is perceived in everyday life. The principles that organize images extend into architecture, design, and visual media, creating a continuity between artistic representation and lived experience, suggesting that the eye remains conditioned by the systems it has learned to navigate. The recognition that perception is structured does not imply that the viewer is entirely passive or that interpretation is fixed, but rather that the range of possible interpretations is shaped by the frameworks within which perception occurs, suggesting that freedom of seeing exists within limits defined by these frameworks. The viewer can engage with an image in multiple ways, but these ways are constrained by the organization of the image, the conventions that govern its construction, and the knowledge that the viewer brings to the encounter, demonstrating that perception is both flexible and bounded. This bounded flexibility allows for variation while maintaining coherence, ensuring that images can be understood in ways that are communicable, even as they allow for individual differences in interpretation. The implications of this understanding extend beyond the realm of art to encompass all forms of visual experience, suggesting that the structures that guide perception in art also operate in everyday contexts, shaping how the world is seen and understood. The viewer does not leave these structures behind, but carries them into other environments, applying the same patterns of attention, recognition, and interpretation to the images and spaces encountered in daily life, indicating that perception is not a neutral or purely biological function, but a culturally and historically informed activity. The eye, shaped by systems that remain largely invisible, continues to operate within these conditions, ensuring that the experience of seeing reflects the structures that define its possibilities. To understand that the eye is not free is not to diminish the experience of seeing, but to deepen it, revealing that perception is an engagement with systems that shape how the world appears, allowing the viewer to become aware of the processes that guide their vision, and to recognize the conditions that make their experience possible. This awareness does not remove these structures, but renders them visible, transforming the act of seeing into a reflective activity that acknowledges its own conditions, suggesting that the freedom of perception lies not in its independence from structure, but in the capacity to recognize and engage with the systems that define it. The act of seeing never occurs without limits, even when those limits are not immediately visible, and it is within these limits that perception is first organized, structured, and directed. The frame, in its most fundamental sense, establishes these limits by determining what belongs to the image and what remains outside it, creating a boundary that separates the visible from the invisible and defines the conditions under which visual experience can occur. This boundary does not simply contain the image but produces it, as the selection of what is included and excluded determines not only what is seen but how it is understood, revealing that perception begins not with the object itself, but with the conditions that allow it to appear. The viewer, encountering an image, often assumes that the frame functions as a neutral border, a passive edge that encloses what is already complete, yet this assumption obscures the role of the frame as an active structure that shapes perception from its very origin, establishing a field within which meaning can be constructed and outside of which it cannot be accessed. The delimitation introduced by the frame operates as a condition of possibility, as it defines the scope of attention and restricts the range of visual information that can be processed, ensuring that perception remains focused and coherent, rather than dispersed across an infinite field. This restriction is not experienced as limitation, but as clarity, as the removal of excess information allows the viewer to concentrate on what is present within the frame, producing a sense of order that appears natural and self-evident. The effectiveness of the frame depends on this transformation of exclusion into coherence, as what is omitted becomes invisible not only in a literal sense but also in a conceptual one, disappearing from consideration as if it were never relevant to begin with. The viewer does not perceive the absence created by the frame, but only the presence that it enables, indicating that the power of the frame lies in its ability to define reality through omission as much as through inclusion. This process of selection aligns with broader structures of representation that determine how images function as systems of meaning, suggesting that the frame is not an isolated device, but part of a larger network of conventions that govern how visual information is organized and interpreted. The analysis of representation, developed by Louis Marin, emphasizes that the frame establishes a space of representation that is distinct from the space of the viewer, creating a separation that allows the image to function as a self-contained system, governed by its own internal relations. This separation produces a condition in which the viewer engages with the image as an object that can be observed and interpreted, rather than as an extension of the surrounding environment, indicating that the frame not only defines what is seen, but also how it is approached. The viewer, positioned outside the frame, encounters a world that is already organized, entering into a relationship with the system that has been structured prior to their engagement, suggesting that perception is guided from the moment it begins. The historical development of framing practices reveals that the frame has not always functioned in the same way, as different periods have employed varying strategies to define the boundaries of representation, reflecting shifts in how images are conceived and how viewers are positioned in relation to them. In medieval art, for example, the absence of a strict separation between image and surrounding space allowed figures to appear as part of a continuous visual field, where narrative and symbolic meaning extended beyond the confines of a clearly defined frame. The emergence of the Renaissance introduced a more rigid distinction, as the development of perspective and the use of architectural framing devices created images that functioned as windows onto constructed spaces, reinforcing the idea that the frame delineates a separate realm that can be entered visually, but not physically. This transformation reflects a broader shift in the conception of representation, as images become more closely aligned with systems of perception that emphasize coherence, stability, and control, indicating that the frame plays a central role in shaping how visual experience is structured. The relationship between the frame and perspective further clarifies how boundaries influence perception, as the frame establishes the limits within which perspective operates, ensuring that the organization of space remains contained and coherent, the convergence of lines toward a vanishing point, the alignment of forms within a structured field, and the positioning of the viewer at a fixed location all depend on the presence of a boundary that defines the extent of the visual field, demonstrating that perspective cannot function without the constraints imposed by the frame. The viewer, encountering such images, adopts a position that corresponds to the logic of the construction, aligning their perception with the structure of the image and reinforcing the impression that the space within the frame is continuous and real. This alignment reveals that the frame does not merely enclose the image, but actively participates in its construction, ensuring that the systems that organize perception remain effective. The conceptual implications of the frame extend beyond its physical manifestation to encompass broader practices of selection and exclusion that operate across different forms of visual representation, suggesting that framing is not limited to the borders of a painting but functions as a fundamental principle that shapes how images are produced and interpreted. The act of choosing what to depict, where to position elements, and how to organize visual information, all involve decisions that define the boundaries of the image, indicating that framing is embedded within the process of creation itself. The viewer, encountering the result of these decisions, engages with a representation that reflects not only what is present, but also what has been omitted, revealing that the meaning of the image depends on the interplay between inclusion and exclusion. The absence created by the frame is not empty, but structured, as it determines the limits of interpretation and guides the viewer towards specific readings, suggesting that what is not shown is as significant as what is visible. The role of the frame in directing attention becomes particularly evident when considering how visual hierarchies are established within the image, as the boundaries of the frame concentrate the viewer's gaze, encouraging a focus on central elements while diminishing the importance of peripheral details. This concentration is reinforced by compositional strategies that align with the structure of the frame, creating patterns that guide the eye towards specific points of interest and shape the sequence in which elements are perceived. The viewer does not move randomly within the image, but follows paths that have been organized to produce coherence, indicating that attention is not freely distributed, but directed by the interplay between the frame and the internal structure of the image. The effectiveness of this guidance depends on its subtlety, as the viewer experiences their movement through the image as self-directed, even as it aligns with patterns that have been carefully constructed. The extension of framing beyond traditional art forms into modern media further demonstrates its fundamental role in shaping perception, as the principles that define what is visible and what is excluded continue to operate in photography, film, and digital imagery, influencing how visual information is organized and interpreted across different contexts. The camera, for example, functions as a framing device that selects a portion of reality, transforming it into an image that reflects the conditions of its capture, indicating that framing is not limited to artistic practice, but is inherent in any act of visual representation. The viewer, encountering such images, engages with a constructed reality that appears immediate and unmediated, even as it reflects decisions that shape how the scene is presented, suggesting that the frame continues to operate as a structure that defines the conditions of perception. The recognition that the frame decides everything does not imply that meaning is fixed or that interpretation is predetermined, but rather that the possibilities of interpretation are shaped by the boundaries within which perception occurs, indicating that freedom of seeing exists within constraints that define what can be considered. The viewer, engaging with an image, operates within a field that has been structured by the frame, exploring possibilities that are made available while remaining unaware of those that have been excluded, suggesting that perception is both guided and limited. This limitation does not diminish the richness of visual experience, but provides the conditions under which coherence can be achieved, ensuring that the image can be understood as a unified whole, rather than as a fragment of an unbounded field. To understand that the frame decides everything is to recognize that perception begins with selection, that what is seen is always defined by what is excluded, and that the boundaries of the image shape not only its content, but its meaning, revealing that the act of seeing is structured from the moment it begins. The viewer, becoming aware of this structure, gains the ability to reflect on the conditions that shape their perception, recognizing that the image is not a neutral presentation of reality, but a constructed field that organizes attention, interpretation, and understanding, suggesting that the frame does not merely surround the image, but determines how it exists, how it is seen, and how it is understood. The invention of linear perspective does not merely alter the visual appearance of images, but restructures the very conditions under which perception is organized, introducing a system in which space is no longer encountered as open, variable, or contingent, but as unified, continuous, and governed by relations that depend on a single, fixed point of view. This transformation produces a mode of seeing that appears self-evident, precisely because it is so effective in aligning perception with its own logic, creating the impression that space simply unfolds naturally before the eye, even as this unfolding depends on a constructed alignment between viewer and image. The viewer, positioned before such an image, does not explore freely, but is placed within a system that requires adherence to its conditions, revealing that vision is not autonomous, but structured by the mechanisms through which representation is organized. The stability and clarity associated with perspective rely on this positioning, ensuring that perception conforms to a framework that remains largely invisible, allowing the viewer to experience coherence without recognizing the constraints that produce it. The formalization of perspective by Leon Battista Alberti establishes this system as a method grounded in geometry, defining the image as a constructed plane through which the world is ordered according to measurable relations. Alberti's conception of the pictorial surface as a window introduces a model of vision that depends on alignment, requiring the viewer to occupy a precise position from which the depicted space resolves into coherence. This formulation does not simply describe how images can represent space, but prescribes how they must be seen, indicating that the viewer's role is not to interpret freely, but to conform to the logic embedded within the image. The apparent transparency of this system conceals its prescriptive nature, allowing the viewer to experience the image as if it were an extension of natural vision, rather than a constructed framework that directs perception. The experimental demonstrations associated with Filippo Brunelleschi make explicit the dependence of perspective on the stability of the observer's position, revealing that the illusion of depth collapses when the viewer shifts away from the designated point. The use of controlled viewing conditions, including mirrors and apertures, demonstrates that spatial coherence is not inherent in the image, but produced through the alignment between eye and representation. This alignment underscores that perspective is not a neutral translation of vision, but a system that requires compliance, indicating that perception is structured through relations that fix the observer within a defined spatial framework. The theoretical interpretation of perspective as a symbolic form by Erwin Panofsky extends this analysis beyond technique, situating perspective within a broader intellectual and cultural context that defines how space is conceptualized. Perspective, in this account, reflects a worldview in which space is understood as homogeneous, continuous, and infinitely extendable, aligning visual representation with developments in mathematics and scientific thought that prioritize measurement and rational order. The viewer, positioned within this system, adopts a mode of seeing that corresponds to these principles, interpreting visual information according to a structure that organizes objects within a unified field. The coherence of perspective thus reflects not the natural structure of vision, but a historically specific model of spatial understanding that becomes internalized through repeated exposure. This recognition introduces a necessary expansion beyond a single tradition, as the assumption that perspective represents a universal mode of seeing can only be sustained if alternative systems of representation are excluded from consideration. The work of Michael Baxandall, particularly through the concept of the period I, demonstrates that perception is shaped by cultural conditions that determine how visual information is processed and understood, suggesting that the ability to interpret perspective depends on learned habits, rather than innate capacity. If perception is conditioned in this way, then the systems developed in other regions and periods must be understood as equally structured modes of vision that organize space according to different principles, revealing that perspective is one configuration among many, rather than a universal standard. Within this expanded framework, the spatial constructions found in Chinese landscape painting articulate a mode of vision that does not fix the viewer in a single position, but allows perception to unfold through movement and duration. In works associated with Fan Quan, such as Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, space is constructed through layered recession and shifting viewpoints that cannot be reduced to a single perspective. The viewer's gaze moves through the image, encountering different zones that reveal themselves gradually, indicating that perception is not stabilized, but dynamic. This mode of seeing aligns with philosophical traditions that emphasize the relationship between human presence and the natural world, suggesting that vision operates through participation rather than observation from a fixed point. A comparable divergence from perspectival fixation can be observed in Islamic manuscript painting, where the organization of space resists the unification associated with linear perspective, presenting instead a field structured through pattern, hierarchy, and narrative clarity. The absence of a vanishing point does not indicate a lack of order, but reflects a different system in which multiple viewpoints coexist without being resolved into a single spatial framework. The viewer engages with the image through a process that unfolds sequentially, suggesting that perception is guided through temporal engagement rather than instantaneous alignment. Scholars such as Oleg Grabar have emphasized that such images construct meaning through surface organization and repetition, indicating that visual coherence can be achieved without reliance on a fixed viewpoint. The multiplicity of spatial systems is further evident in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican codices, where figures and environments are arranged according to symbolic and narrative relationships rather than optical realism. The viewer does not occupy a single position, but engages with the image as a structured field in which meaning is distributed across elements that function collectively, rather than through perspectival depth. This organization reflects a conception of space that prioritizes relational meaning over visual illusion, suggesting that perception operates through frameworks that differ fundamentally from those established by linear perspective. The fixation introduced by perspective therefore represents a specific historical development that establishes a particular relationship between viewer and image, one that emphasizes stability, control, and singularity of viewpoint. This fixation produces a form of visual authority, as the image presents itself as coherent and complete when viewed correctly, suggesting that the correct interpretation depends on adherence to its system. The viewer experiences this coherence as natural, reinforcing the impression that the image reflects reality rather than constructing it, even as this construction determines how space is perceived. The relationship between perspective and power becomes evident when considering how the fixed viewpoint aligns with broader structures of knowledge and control, suggesting that the ability to define the position from which something is seen corresponds to the ability to define how it is understood. The analysis of visual regimes by Michel Foucault emphasizes that perception is linked to systems that regulate knowledge, indicating that the organization of vision reflects structures that determine how truth is constructed and maintained. The fixed viewpoint of perspective aligns with a model of observation that assumes stability and authority, suggesting that the viewer occupies a position that mirrors broader configurations of power. The transformation of perspective within modern art reveals both its persistence and its instability, as artists challenge the fixed viewpoint while continuing to engage with its underlying logic. The fractured spatial constructions of Pablo Picasso disrupt the coherence of perspective by presenting multiple viewpoints simultaneously, requiring the viewer to navigate between competing spatial cues. This disruption exposes the constructed nature of perspective, indicating that its coherence depends on conditions that can be altered or dismantled, suggesting that perception is not fixed, but contingent. The continuation of perspective within photography and digital media demonstrates its adaptability, as technologies that capture and reproduce images often rely on principles derived from linear perspective, reinforcing its influence on how space is represented and perceived. The camera, positioned as a fixed point, organizes the image according to a viewpoint that aligns with perspectival logic, indicating that the fixation of the viewer persists even as new forms of representation emerge. Digital environments extend this logic into virtual spaces, where perspective structures how users navigate and interact with simulated worlds, suggesting that the system continues to shape perception across different media. The fixation of the viewer within perspective does not eliminate the possibility of interpretation, but defines the conditions under which it occurs, indicating that perception operates within a framework that limits variability while allowing for engagement within those limits. The viewer can interpret and move visually within the image, but this movement unfolds within a system that determines how space is organized and how it can be perceived. The act of seeing is therefore structured, suggesting that freedom operates within constraints that define its possibilities. Perspective fixes the viewer in place, not by restricting movement entirely, but by establishing a framework that determines how movement can occur, aligning perception with a system that organizes space according to a singular viewpoint. The viewer, encountering such images, participates in a mode of seeing that appears natural, while being constructed through principles that guide how the world is perceived. The recognition of this condition reveals that vision is not independent but structured, indicating that the act of seeing is shaped by relations that position the observer within a field that has already been defined, ensuring that perception aligns with systems that organize how space is understood. Space is often experienced as a passive condition, an empty container within which objects are arranged and through which movement occurs, presenting itself as neutral, continuous, and without intention, as if it exists independently of the structures that define it and the bodies that move within it. This assumption persists because the organization of space is rarely perceived directly, as the systems that shape it operate at a level that remains largely unnoticed, guiding movement, orientation, and perception without drawing attention to their presence. The viewer, moving through a museum, a street, or an architectural interior, experiences space as something that simply is, rather than something that has been constructed, leading to the belief that spatial experience originates from the individual's interaction with an environment that exists prior to and independent of their perception. This belief depends on the invisibility of the mechanisms that organize space, ensuring that the conditions that structure movement and attention remain concealed, allowing the experience of space to appear natural and unmediated. This apparent neutrality dissolves when space is understood not as an empty field, but as a system of relations that determines how objects are positioned, how movement unfolds, and how perception is guided, revealing that space is produced rather than given. The theoretical framework developed by Henri Lefebvre articulates this condition with precision, demonstrating that space is not a passive container, but a social product shaped by practices, representations, and institutional forces that define how it is organized and experienced. Lefebvre's distinction between spatial practice, representations of space, and representational space reveals that what appears as stable and continuous is in fact the result of processes that align physical arrangements, conceptual systems, and lived experience into a coherent structure. The viewer does not simply occupy space, but participates in a system that has been constructed through historical and cultural conditions, suggesting that spatial experience is inseparable from the forces that produce it. The recognition that space is produced rather than given requires a reorientation of how spatial perception is understood, as the dominant conception of space as homogeneous and neutral emerges from a specific intellectual tradition rather than from universal experience. The philosophical work of Edward S. Casey emphasizes that space must be distinguished from place, arguing that place is grounded in lived experience, memory, and cultural meaning, while abstract space represents a conceptual abstraction that obscures these dimensions. This distinction reveals that neutrality depends on a process of reduction, in which the richness of spatial experience is simplified into measurable extension, suggesting that the perception of space is always shaped by frameworks that determine how it is understood. The viewer does not encounter space as an abstract field, but as a situated environment structured through relations that define how it is experienced. The embodied nature of spatial perception further complicates the notion of neutrality, as the analysis of Maurice Merleau-Ponty demonstrates that space is not external to the body, but emerges through the body's orientation and movement. Perception is not a detached observation of an external world, but an engagement that unfolds through the body's interaction with its surroundings, suggesting that spatial relations are constituted through experience rather than existing independently of it. The viewer does not move through a pre-existing space, but participates in the formation of spatial meaning through bodily engagement, indicating that perception is shaped by conditions that align the body with its environment. This theoretical framework necessitates a broader comparative perspective, as the assumption that space is neutral can only be sustained when alternative spatial systems are excluded. Across different cultures and historical contexts, space has been organized according to principles that differ fundamentally from the homogeneous and continuous model associated with modern Western thought, revealing that spatial perception is not universal but contingent upon cultural frameworks. In ancient Egyptian visual culture, spatial organization is structured through symbolic and hierarchical relations, rather than optical coherence, as seen in Nibelungen hunting in the marshes, where scale reflects importance rather than distance. The viewer engages with a system that prioritizes meaning over illusion, indicating that space functions as a conceptual structure rather than a visual field. A distinct approach to spatial organization emerges within Mesoamerican codices, such as those of the Mixtec tradition, where narrative and symbolic relationships determine how space is constructed. Figures and events are arranged within a flattened visual field that resists perspectival depth, requiring the viewer to interpret spatial relations through symbolic association rather than optical cues. The absence of a fixed viewpoint does not produce ambiguity, but reflects a system in which space is structured through meaning rather than through geometry, suggesting that perception operates through frameworks that differ fundamentally from those established by linear perspective. The spatial logic of medieval European art similarly demonstrates that the unification of space through perspective is not inevitable, as compositions often organize space through vertical hierarchies and symbolic arrangements, rather than through continuous depth. In works such as the Meister, the viewer encounters a space that is structured through theological significance, rather than optical realism, indicating that perception is guided by frameworks that prioritize meaning over visual coherence. The multiplicity of spatial systems across these traditions reveals that neutrality is not an inherent property of space, but an effect produced when a particular system becomes dominant and internalized. The organization of architectural space provides a particularly clear manifestation of how spatial systems guide perception and movement, as the arrangement of structural elements defines how environments are experienced. The verticality and luminosity of Gothic architecture, as seen in Chartres Cathedral, create a spatial experience that directs perception upward, aligning the viewer's body and gaze with a sense of transcendence. The height of the nave, the filtering of light through stained glass, and the elongation of vertical lines produce an environment that shapes perception through scale and orientation, indicating that space is constructed to produce specific effects. The phenomenological analysis of Gaston Bachelard further develops this understanding by emphasizing the role of memory, imagination, and intimacy in shaping spatial experience. In this account, space is not merely physical but psychological, structured through associations that influence how environments are perceived and inhabited. The viewer's experience of space is shaped not only by its physical organization, but by the meanings that are attached to it, suggesting that spatial perception operates through layers that extend beyond immediate sensory experience. The relationship between space and power introduces another dimension, as spatial organization often reflects structures that regulate behavior and perception. The analysis of Michel Foucault demonstrates that architecture functions as a mechanism through which visibility and control are organized, shaping how individuals move and interact within an environment. The design of spaces such as hospitals, schools, and administrative buildings reflects systems that define how bodies are positioned and observed, indicating that space operates as a medium through which authority is exercised. The structuring of urban space further reveals that spatial organization operates at a collective level, shaping how populations move and interact. The layout of cities, the distribution of public and private spaces, and the organization of transportation systems all reflect decisions that influence how environments are experienced, indicating that space is constructed through processes that extend beyond individual perception. The viewer moving through such environments engages with systems that guide movement and attention, even as these systems remain largely invisible. The extension of spatial structuring into contemporary digital environments demonstrates that the production of space continues to evolve, as virtual interfaces organize how users navigate information and interact with the visual content. The arrangement of screens, the sequencing of content, and the design of interactive elements create environments that guide perception in ways that parallel physical space, suggesting that spatial organization persists even in contexts that lack physical form. The viewer experiences navigation as intuitive, yet this intuition is produced through systems that define how space is structured. The perception of openness or enclosure further illustrates that spatial experience is constructed through relations that shape how environments are interpreted. A space that appears open may still guide movement through subtle alignments, while a space that appears enclosed may produce a sense of containment that influences perception, indicating that these qualities are not inherent, but produced through organization. The viewer responds to these conditions, experiencing space as expansive or confined, even as these experiences reflect the structures that define how the environment is encountered. To recognize that space is never neutral is to understand that spatial experience is produced through systems that shape how environments are organized, how movement unfolds, and how perception is guided, revealing that what appears as an empty container is in fact an active structure that defines the possibilities of experience. The viewer, becoming aware of this condition, encounters space not as a passive backdrop, but as a constructed field that shapes how the world is seen and navigated, indicating that perception itself is inseparable from the systems that organize space, and that every act of movement and observation unfolds within frameworks that define how space appears and how it is experienced. The experience of looking is rarely understood as something that occurs from a predetermined position, as if the viewer arrives before an image or within a space as an independent observer, free to choose where to stand, how to look, and what to notice, creating the impression that perception originates from a place of autonomy rather than from within a system that has already defined the conditions under which it can occur. This impression persists because the act of positioning is concealed, embedded within structures that guide the viewer without appearing to do so, allowing perception to unfold in a manner that feels self-directed while remaining aligned with arrangements that have been carefully constructed. The viewer, encountering an image or moving through a space, experiences their own presence as neutral and unmarked, unaware that their position has been anticipated, shaped, and in many cases prescribed in advance, revealing that the act of seeing is inseparable from the position from which it occurs, and that this position is not freely chosen, but structured through relations that determine how perception can take place. The concept of positioning becomes more apparent when one considers the relationship between the viewer and the image as one of alignment rather than distance, indicating that perception depends on the correspondence between the location of the observer and the organization of the visual field. In systems of representation, structured by linear perspective, for example, the coherence of the image depends on the viewer occupying a specific point from which the arrangement of forms aligns correctly, producing the illusion of depth and continuity that defines the experience of space. The viewer who deviates from this point encounters distortions that reveal the constructed nature of the image, indicating that perception is contingent upon adherence to the conditions established by the system. This requirement demonstrates that the viewer is not free to occupy any position, but must conform to one that has been defined in advance, suggesting that the act of seeing involves a process of positioning that aligns perception with the logic of the image. The articulation of this relationship through the work of Erwin Panofsky reveals that perspective not only organizes space, but establishes a subject position that defines how the viewer relates to the image, situating the observer within a system that aligns vision with a specific conception of reality. This position is not merely physical, but conceptual, as it reflects a mode of seeing that corresponds to broader intellectual frameworks that define how the world is understood, indicating that the viewer is positioned not only in space, but within a system of knowledge that shapes perception. The alignment between representation and subject position ensures that the image can be perceived as coherent and meaningful, reinforcing the impression that the viewer's perspective is natural, even as it reflects the influence of structures that define how perception is organized. The positioning of the viewer extends beyond the confines of the image to encompass the organization of space itself, as architectural environments are designed to guide the observer into specific locations from which visual and spatial relations can be perceived in particular ways. The placement of entrances, the alignment of corridors, and the arrangement of focal points all contribute to the structuring of movement and perception, ensuring that the viewer encounters the space in a sequence that reflects its intended organization. The viewer, moving through such an environment, experiences their path as self-directed, even as it aligns with patterns that have been anticipated and constructed, indicating that positioning operates not only at the level of visual representation, but within the broader context of spatial experience. The theoretical framework provided by Michel Foucault further clarifies how positioning functions within systems of power and knowledge, suggesting that the organization of space and vision is linked to mechanisms that regulate how individuals are situated within structures that define their roles and relationships. In this context, the positioning of the viewer can be understood as part of a broader system in which perception is aligned with forms of control that shape how the world is seen and understood, indicating that the act of looking is not neutral, but participates in structures that define its possibilities. The viewer, positioned within these structures, engages with a field that has been organized to produce specific forms of experience, suggesting that perception is shaped by relations that extend beyond the immediate encounter with the image or space. The role of alignment and positioning becomes particularly evident when considering how symmetry and centrality function within visual and spatial systems, as these principles create points of balance that guide the viewer toward positions from which the organization of the image or environment can be perceived as stable and coherent. The central axis, for example, often serves as a point of orientation that aligns the viewer with the structure of the space, creating a sense of equilibrium that reinforces the perception of order. The viewer, drawn toward this axis, adopts a position that corresponds to the logic of the construction, experiencing the space as harmonious and complete, indicating that positioning operates through mechanisms that guide the observer toward specific locations that enable the perception of coherence. The influence of positioning on perception also extends to the organization of attention, as the viewer's location determines how visual information is distributed within the field of vision, shaping what can be seen and how it is interpreted. The height at which an object is placed, the distance from which it is viewed, and the angle at which it is approached all contribute to the formation of a perceptual experience that reflects the alignment between the viewer and the object, indicating that perception is shaped by spatial relations that define how visual information is accessed. The viewer, positioned in relation to these elements, experiences the image or object as structured and coherent, even as this coherence depends on the conditions that define how it is perceived. The work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that perception is grounded in the body, suggesting that positioning is not only a matter of visual alignment, but of embodied experience, as the viewer's physical presence within space influences how it is perceived and understood. The body, in this sense, becomes the point through which space is organized, as its orientation, movement, and relation to surrounding elements shape the conditions of perception, indicating that positioning involves the integration of visual and bodily experience. The viewer does not simply occupy a position, but inhabits it, engaging with a system that aligns perception with the conditions of their presence within the environment. The apparent freedom of movement within space does not negate the structuring of positioning, but rather depends on it, as the ability to navigate an environment relies on the presence of cues that guide orientation and movement, ensuring that the viewer can move in ways that align with the organization of the space. The viewer, experiencing this movement as voluntary, remains unaware of the extent to which it is shaped by structures that define possible paths and positions, indicating that positioning operates through a balance between guidance and autonomy that maintains the illusion of freedom while directing perception. This balance allows spatial systems to function effectively without becoming visible, ensuring that the viewer engages with them as if they were natural rather than constructed. The extension of positioning into everyday visual environments further demonstrates that the structuring of the viewer's position is not limited to artistic or architectural contexts, but operates across all forms of visual experience, influencing how images are encountered and how space is navigated in daily life. The arrangement of visual information in media, the design of interfaces, and the organization of public spaces all reflect similar processes of positioning, guiding the viewer's attention and shaping their experience in ways that remain largely unnoticed. The viewer, engaging with these environments, participates in systems that define how perception occurs, indicating that positioning is a fundamental aspect of visual experience that extends beyond specific contexts. To understand that you are being positioned is to recognize that the act of seeing is inseparable from the conditions that define where and how it occurs, revealing that perception is structured through relations that guide the viewer into positions that align with the organization of images and spaces. The viewer, becoming aware of this structure, gains the ability to reflect on the mechanisms that shape their perception, recognizing that their position is not neutral but constructed, and that the experience of seeing depends on alignment with systems that define its possibilities. This recognition transforms the act of looking, revealing that what appears as freedom is shaped by structures that guide perception, ensuring that the viewer's engagement with the world remains organized, directed, and structured by conditions that extend beyond their immediate awareness. Movement is often experienced as the most immediate expression of freedom, as if the ability to walk, turn, pause, and change direction reflects an autonomy that exists prior to and independent of the environments within which these actions occur, creating the impression that the body determines its own path and that space merely accommodates its motion without influencing it. This impression persists because the structures that guide movement are rarely perceived as such, operating through arrangements that shape direction, rhythm, and sequence without appearing to impose constraints, allowing the viewer to experience their own movement as spontaneous and self-directed. The act of moving through a museum, a building, or an urban environment feels fluid and intuitive, as if the path unfolds naturally in response to the viewer's intentions. Yet this apparent naturalness conceals the extent to which movement is organized by systems that anticipate and direct the body, revealing that motion is not free but structured, not improvised but designed. The design of movement begins with the organization of space, as the placement of entrances, exits, corridors, and thresholds establishes a framework within which the body can navigate, determining possible paths and restricting others, ensuring that movement occurs within a field that has been defined in advance. The viewer, entering a space, does not encounter an infinite range of possibilities, but a set of options that have been structured to produce coherence, guiding the body through sequences that reflect the logic of the environment. The alignment of pathways creates trajectories that feel continuous. The positioning of openings directs transitions between spaces, and the arrangement of obstacles shapes the flow of movement, indicating that motion is guided by relations that organize how the body moves through the environment. This guidance operates without appearing as control, as the viewer experiences their movement as voluntary, even as it follows patterns that have been anticipated and constructed. The theoretical framework developed by Henri Lefebvre provides a foundation for understanding this condition, as his analysis of spatial practice emphasizes that movement is an integral component of the production of space, reflecting the ways in which environments are organized to shape how they are used and experienced. In this account, movement is not an incidental aspect of space, but a fundamental dimension of its structure, as the paths that bodies follow contribute to the formation of spatial relations that define how the environment functions. The viewer, moving through such a space, participates in a system that aligns physical motion with conceptual organization, indicating that movement is both produced by and productive of the spatial structures within which it occurs. The choreography of movement becomes particularly evident in architectural environments, where the sequence of spaces is arranged to guide the viewer through a progression that unfolds over time, creating a narrative that is experienced through motion rather than through static observation. The placement of focal points, the modulation of light, and the variation in scale all contribute to the structuring of this sequence, producing moments of emphasis, transition, and pause that shape how the environment is encountered. The viewer, moving through such a sequence, experiences a rhythm that feels natural, as if the progression of spaces follows an internal logic that corresponds to their own movement. Yet this correspondence reflects the alignment between design and perception, indicating that movement has been structured to produce a coherent experience. The environment, in this sense, does not simply allow movement, but orchestrates it, guiding the viewer through a series of positions that define how the space is perceived. The relationship between movement and perception further clarifies how motion is structured, as the act of moving through space influences what is seen, how it is seen, and in what order it is encountered, indicating that perception unfolds over time through a sequence that is shaped by the design of movement. The viewer does not perceive the environment as a simultaneous whole, but as a succession of views that are revealed through motion, suggesting that the organization of space determines not only where the viewer moves, but what they are able to see at each moment. The alignment between movement and perception ensures that certain elements are encountered at specific points, creating a progression that reflects the intended structure of the environment, indicating that movement is not separate from perception, but integral to its operation. The phenomenological analysis of perception offered by Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that the body is not merely an object within space, but the condition through which space is experienced, suggesting that movement is not an external action imposed upon an environment, but an embodied process that integrates perception and motion. The body, in this sense, doesn't move through space independently, but responds to the conditions that define how movement can occur, indicating that the experience of motion is shaped by the alignment between bodily orientation and spatial structure. The viewer, engaging with an environment, perceives through movement, as the act of walking, turning, and pausing produces a sequence of perceptions that define how the space is understood, demonstrating that movement is not separate from seeing, but part of the process through which perception unfolds. The structuring of movement can also be understood through the analysis of visual cues that guide the body, as elements such as lines, light, and spatial hierarchy influence how the viewer navigates the environment, directing attention and shaping the flow of motion. The alignment of architectural elements creates directional forces that encourage movement along specific paths. The distribution of light highlights areas of importance that draw the viewer forward, and the organization of space into distinct zones produces transitions that structure the experience of movement, indicating that motion is guided by a network of visual and spatial relations that operate together to shape how the environment is encountered. The viewer, responding to these cues, experiences movement as intuitive, even as it reflects the influence of structures that define its course. The concept of movement as designed extends beyond architecture into the organization of images, as visual compositions guide the viewer's eye through sequences that mimic physical motion, creating paths of attention that shape how the image is read and understood. The arrangement of forms, the use of directional lines, and the distribution of visual weight all contribute to the creation of movement within the image, directing the viewer's gaze along trajectories that reflect the structure of the composition. The viewer, engaging with such images, experiences a form of visual motion that parallels physical movement, indicating that the design of movement operates across different levels of perception, shaping both how the body moves through space and how the eye moves through the image. The relationship between movement and control becomes evident when considering how the structuring of motion limits the range of possible paths that the viewer can take, ensuring that movement aligns with the intended organization of the environment. The viewer, while experiencing freedom of motion, operates within constraints that define where they can go and how they can move, indicating that movement is both enabled and restricted by the design of space. This balance between freedom and constraint allows movement to appear natural while maintaining control, ensuring that the viewer's path remains coherent and aligned with the structure of the environment. The effectiveness of this control depends on its invisibility, as the viewer must experience their movement as voluntary in order for the system to function without resistance. The extension of design movement into everyday environments demonstrates that the structuring of motion is not limited to specific contexts, but operates across all forms of spatial experience, shaping how the world is navigated and understood. The layout of cities, the design of transportation systems, and the organization of public spaces all reflect similar principles of movement design, guiding the flow of bodies through environments in ways that produce efficiency, coherence, and control. The viewer, moving through these environments, participates in systems that shape their motion, indicating that movement is always structured by relations that define its possibilities, even when these relations remain unnoticed. To understand that movement is designed is to recognize that motion is not an expression of unrestricted freedom, but an engagement with systems that shape how the body moves through space, revealing that the paths taken, the sequences followed, and the rhythms experienced are the result of structures that organize movement in ways that align with the design of the environment. The viewer, becoming aware of these structures, gains the ability to perceive movement not as a spontaneous activity, but as a process that unfolds within a framework that defines its conditions, suggesting that the experience of motion is inseparable from the systems that produce it, and that the act of moving through space is guided by relations that shape how the world is encountered and understood. The experience of looking at an image is rarely recognized as a guided process, as if the eye moves freely across the surface, selecting points of interest according to personal inclination, curiosity, or chance, creating the impression that attention is self-directed and that perception unfolds without constraint. This impression persists because the mechanisms that organize visual attention operate at a level that remains largely unnoticed, structuring how the eye moves, where it pauses, and what it returns to, without appearing to impose control. The viewer, encountering a painting, a photograph, or any constructed image, experiences the act of looking as a sequence of choices that originate from within, unaware that these choices are shaped by the arrangement of elements within the image, revealing that the eye does not move freely, but is guided by relations that determine how visual information is organized and perceived. The apparent autonomy of attention depends on the invisibility of these relations, ensuring that the viewer experiences coherence as a natural consequence of seeing rather than as the result of composition. The concept of composition, understood as the arrangement of visual elements within a bounded field, defines the structure through which attention is directed, establishing patterns that guide the eye along specific paths and create sequences that shape how the image is experienced over time. The viewer does not perceive all elements simultaneously, but engages with the image through a progression of attention that reflects the organization of its parts, indicating that composition operates as a temporal structure that unfolds through the movement of the eye. The alignment of forms, the distribution of visual weight, and the positioning of focal points all contribute to this process, creating a network of relations that influence how the image is read and understood. The viewer, responding to these relations, experiences the image as coherent and unified, even as this coherence depends on the structuring of attention that composition provides. The theoretical framework developed by Rudolf Arnheim provides a foundation for understanding how composition operates as a system of perceptual organization, demonstrating that visual experience is governed by principles that determine how elements are grouped, balanced, and related within the field of vision. These principles derive from Gestalt psychology, emphasize that perception seeks coherence, organizing visual input into patterns that produce stability and meaning, suggesting that the eye is drawn toward configurations that satisfy these conditions. The viewer does not simply observe individual elements, but perceives relationships between them, constructing a whole that reflects the interaction of its parts, indicating that composition functions as a system that guides perception toward specific interpretations. The arrangement of elements within the image influences how these relationships are perceived, directing attention in ways that align with the structure of the composition. The role of lines within composition provides one of the most direct mechanisms through which attention is guided, as linear elements create directional forces that influence how the eye moves across the image, establishing paths that connect different areas and shape the sequence of perception. These lines may be explicit, as in the contours of forms or the edges of objects, or implicit, emerging from the alignment of elements that create visual trajectories, indicating that composition operates through both visible and invisible structures that guide attention. The viewer, following these lines, experiences movement within the image, as the eye travels along paths that have been constructed to produce coherence, suggesting that composition transforms the static surface into a dynamic field in which perception unfolds through directed motion. The distribution of visual weight further contributes to the structuring of attention, as elements within the image exert varying degrees of influence based on factors such as size, contrast, color, and position, creating a hierarchy that determines which areas attract the eye more strongly. The viewer, responding to these differences, is drawn toward points of emphasis that function as focal areas, establishing centers of attention that anchor the composition and provide orientation within the visual field. The relationship between these focal points and the surrounding elements creates a balance that shapes how the image is perceived, ensuring that attention is distributed in a manner that reflects the structure of the composition. The viewer experiences this distribution as natural, even as it reflects the deliberate arrangement of elements that guide perception. The concept of balance within composition introduces a further dimension to this analysis, as the arrangement of elements creates a sense of stability or tension that influences how the image is experienced. Symmetrical compositions produce a sense of equilibrium that reinforces coherence, while asymmetrical arrangements introduce dynamic relationships that create movement and variation, indicating that composition operates through the calibration of forces that shape perception. The viewer, engaging with these arrangements, experiences the image as either stable or dynamic, depending on how these forces are organized, suggesting that composition not only directs attention, but also shapes the qualitative experience of looking. The integration of light within composition further refines the structuring of attention, as variations in illumination create contrasts that highlight certain elements while subordinating others, establishing a hierarchy that guides the eye toward areas of significance. The viewer, responding to these contrasts, experiences the image as though organized according to patterns of light and shadow that define what is visible and what recedes, indicating that composition operates through the manipulation of visibility itself. The alignment between light and composition ensures that attention is directed in ways that correspond to the intended structure of the image, reinforcing the coherence of the visual field. The relationship between composition and meaning becomes evident when considering how the arrangement of elements influences interpretation, as the positioning of figures, the alignment of gestures, and the organization of space all contribute to the construction of narrative and symbolic significance. The viewer, engaging with these arrangements, interprets the image according to patterns that reflect its composition, suggesting that meaning is not inherent in individual elements, but emerges from the relationships between them. The structuring of these relationships guides the viewer toward specific readings, indicating that composition functions as a system that shapes not only what is seen, but how it is understood. The historical development of compositional strategies reveals that the organization of attention has evolved in response to changing conceptions of representation, reflecting shifts in how images are constructed and how viewers are positioned in relation to them. The transition from medieval to Renaissance composition, for example, introduces a greater emphasis on coherence, balance, and spatial organization, aligning visual structures with systems of perspective that guide attention in ways that reflect the logic of the image. This evolution demonstrates that composition is not static, but responsive to broader changes in visual culture, indicating that the structuring of attention reflects the conditions within which images are produced and perceived. The extension of compositional principles into other forms of visual media further demonstrates their fundamental role in shaping perception, as the organization of images in photography, film, and digital media continues to rely on the arrangement of elements to guide attention and produce meaning. The viewer, encountering these forms, engages with systems that operate according to similar principles, indicating that composition functions as a universal mechanism through which visual experience is structured across different contexts. The movement of the eye across an image does not arise spontaneously, but follows trajectories embedded within the arrangement of its elements, revealing that attention is guided by relations that organize how visual information unfolds over time. What appears as a personal choice of where to look is shaped by patterns that direct perception toward specific areas, establish sequences of viewing, and create hierarchies that determine significance. The image operates as a structured field in which vision is oriented, pulled, and stabilized, ensuring that coherence emerges through alignment between the viewer's attention and the composition itself. The act of looking, therefore, is not an open exploration, but an engagement with a system that channels perception along paths that have already been constructed. Light is frequently understood as a neutral condition that makes vision possible, as if illumination simply reveals what already exists without influencing how it is perceived, creating the impression that visibility is an objective state determined by the presence of sufficient brightness rather than by the organization of that brightness across a visual field. This assumption persists because the structuring role of light is embedded within perception itself, operating at a level that remains largely unexamined, allowing the viewer to experience the visible as immediate and self-evident. Yet illumination does not merely disclose objects, but differentiates orders and prioritizes them, establishing hierarchies that determine what emerges as significant and what recedes into obscurity, indicating that visibility is not an inherent property of objects, but a condition produced through the distribution of light. The eye does not encounter a uniformly illuminated world, but a field structured by gradients, contrasts, and directional intensities that organize perception into zones of attention and neglect, revealing that light functions as a selective mechanism that defines the structure of the visible. The formation of visual distinction through light can be examined through the relationship between illumination and contrast, as perception depends on the differentiation of surfaces that allows objects to be distinguished from their surroundings, suggesting that light operates not as a continuous field, but as a system of variation that produces perceptual boundaries. The insights of James J. Gibson into ecological optics emphasize that vision relies on gradients of light that specify the structure of the environment, indicating that perception emerges from the interaction between illumination and surface properties, rather than from isolated visual stimuli. The viewer perceives depth, texture, and form through variations in light that define how surfaces reflect or absorb illumination, demonstrating that the visible world is constructed through patterns of light that provide information about spatial relations. These gradients are not incidental but fundamental to perception, as they allow the viewer to infer the organization of space through the distribution of brightness and shadow, indicating that light functions as a system of cues that guide interpretation. The modeling of form through light further illustrates how illumination contributes to the construction of visual meaning, as the interplay between highlights and shadows creates the appearance of volume within a two-dimensional surface, enabling the viewer to perceive depth where none physically exists. The theoretical framework developed by Ernst Gombrich emphasizes that such effects depend on learned conventions that allow viewers to interpret light as an indicator of form, suggesting that the perception of three-dimensionality is not an immediate response, but a process that relies on prior knowledge of how light interacts with surfaces. The viewer interprets shading as a sign of curvature, brightness as an indication of proximity to a light source, and shadow as a marker of spatial recession, indicating that the experience of form is mediated by an understanding of illumination that has been internalized through exposure to visual systems. This process reveals that light operates as a representational tool that structures perception by guiding the viewer toward specific interpretations of visual information. The distribution of light within an image establishes a hierarchy that directs attention, as areas of higher illumination attract the eye while darker regions recede, creating a structure of emphasis that determines the sequence in which elements are perceived. This hierarchy functions through contrasts that differentiate focal points from their surroundings, ensuring that certain areas become centers of attention while others serve as supporting contexts, indicating that light operates as a mechanism of selection that organizes the visual field. The viewer does not distribute attention evenly, but responds to variations in illumination that guide the movement of the eye, suggesting that perception unfolds according to patterns defined by the arrangement of light. The structuring of attention through illumination aligns with the principles of visual salience, as described in contemporary perceptual psychology, where differences in brightness, contrast, and color influence the allocation of attention, demonstrating that light plays a central role in determining what is noticed and what is overlooked. The use of light as a compositional device reaches a heightened level of complexity in the works of Caravaggio, where illumination is not distributed evenly, but concentrated in ways that isolate figures and create dramatic contrasts that guide perception toward specific areas of the image. In paintings such as The Calling of St. Matthew, light functions as a directional force that leads the viewer's gaze across the composition, establishing connections between figures and highlighting gestures that carry narrative significance. The darkness that surrounds these illuminated areas is not merely an absence of light, but a structural component that enhances contrast and focuses attention, indicating that visibility is produced through the interplay between illumination and obscurity. The viewer, encountering such images, experiences a form of visual guidance that directs attention along paths defined by light, suggesting that illumination operates as a tool for structuring narrative and meaning within the image. The relationship between light and spatial perception extends beyond individual images to encompass architectural environments, where illumination shapes how space is experienced over time. The orientation of buildings, the placement of openings, and the control of natural light all contribute to the structuring of spatial experience, as the movement of light throughout the day creates variations that influence how the environment is perceived. The analysis of architectural lighting by Louis Kahn emphasizes that light is not merely an additive element, but a defining condition of space, suggesting that architecture is shaped by the ways in which light enters and interacts with surfaces, creating atmospheres that influence perception. The viewer, moving through such spaces, encounters shifts in illumination that alter the perception of scale, texture, and depth, indicating that light functions as a dynamic condition that continuously reorganizes the experience of space. The phenomenological perspective offered by Maurice Merleau-Ponty further clarifies the role of light in perception, as illumination is not simply an external condition, but an integral aspect of how the world is experienced through the body. Light defines the field of visibility within which objects appear, shaping the conditions under which perception occurs, suggesting that seeing is inseparable from the presence of illumination that organizes the relationship between the viewer and the environment. The body does not perceive light as an isolated phenomenon, but as a condition that structures the appearance of objects, indicating that visibility is an embodied experience shaped by the interaction between light and perception. The symbolic dimension of light introduces another layer of complexity, as illumination often carries meanings that influence interpretation, associating brightness with clarity, revelation, or importance, and darkness with obscurity, ambiguity, or marginality. These associations are not universal but culturally constructed, reflecting systems of meaning that shape how light is understood within different contexts. The analysis of visual culture by Louis Marin suggests that light functions as a sign within systems of representation, contributing to the construction of meaning through its distribution and intensity. The viewer interprets illuminated elements as significant, not only because they are more visible, but because they are associated with values that elevate their importance, indicating that light operates within a network of symbolic relations that shape perception. The integration of light within compositional systems further demonstrates its role in structuring visual experience, as illumination interacts with other elements, such as line, color, and form, to create coherent arrangements that guide perception. The alignment between light and composition ensures that attention is directed in ways that reflect the intended organization of the image, reinforcing the hierarchy of elements and supporting the overall structure of the visual field. The viewer, engaging with these arrangements, experiences the image as unified and intelligible, suggesting that light functions as a component of composition that contributes to the organization of visual information. The extension of these principles into modern and contemporary visual media highlights the continued relevance of light as a structuring element, as the use of illumination in photography, film, and digital environments shapes how images are perceived and interpreted. The manipulation of light in these contexts allows for precise control over visibility, attention, and meaning, indicating that illumination remains a fundamental tool for organizing perception across different forms of visual culture. The viewer, encountering these images, engages with systems that rely on the distribution of light to produce specific effects, suggesting that the structuring role of illumination persists across historical and technological contexts. Light organizes the visible field by establishing hierarchies, directing attention, and shaping interpretation, ensuring that perception unfolds according to patterns defined by the distribution of illumination. The eye responds to contrasts, gradients, and intensities that guide the movement of attention and determine what emerges as significant within the visual field, indicating that visibility is not a neutral condition, but a structured experience shaped by relations that define how light operates. The visual world, as it is encountered, reflects the influence of these relations, revealing that what appears as immediate and self-evident is the result of systems that determine what is made visible and what remains unseen, ensuring that perception aligns with structures that define the conditions under which it occurs. Scale does not function as a neutral measure of size, but as a relational system that structures how the viewer encounters and interprets what is seen, transforming magnitude into a condition that shapes perception, attention, and meaning. The experience of scale emerges through comparison, as the body provides the primary reference through which dimensions are understood, ensuring that size is always perceived relative to the viewer, rather than as an abstract property of objects. This relational structure positions the viewer within a field where magnitude determines proximity, dominance, intimacy, and significance, indicating that scale operates not as a passive attribute, but as an active mechanism that organizes perception. The apparent simplicity of size conceals its capacity to produce hierarchies within the visual field, guiding attention and shaping interpretation in ways that influence how objects are experienced and understood. Scale, therefore, becomes inseparable from power, not only in the sense of dominance or authority, but as a broader condition that defines how meaning is constructed through perception, transforming the relationship between viewer and image into a structured encounter in which magnitude determines how the visible is organized. The embodied dimension of scale establishes the foundation for its perceptual effects, as the human body serves as a constant reference point through which magnitude is interpreted, creating a dynamic relationship in which objects larger than the body produce a sense of displacement or diminishment, while those that correspond to or fall below bodily proportions create conditions of familiarity, control, or proximity. The phenomenological framework, articulated by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, emphasizes that perception is grounded in the lived experience of the body, suggesting that scale is not encountered as an abstract measurement, but as a condition that shapes how space and objects are experienced. The viewer's sense of proportion emerges through the alignment between bodily presence and spatial dimension, indicating that magnitude influences not only visual perception, but also orientation, movement, and effective response. This alignment produces a field in which scale becomes inseparable from embodiment, as the viewer experiences size through their own position within space, revealing that perception is structured through relations that integrate the body into the visual field. Within Western art, the relationship between scale and power is often articulated through monumentality, where magnitude produces authority by exceeding the viewer's bodily reference and establishing a hierarchy between observer and object. The enlargement of the human figure in works such as David transforms the body into an idealized presence that commands attention, not simply through size, but through the integration of proportion, balance, and spatial dominance. The viewer, encountering this figure, experiences a shift in perception that emphasizes the autonomy and completeness of the form, positioning the sculpture as an entity that exists beyond ordinary human scale. This transformation reveals that scale operates as a mechanism through which the human body is elevated into a symbol of authority, indicating that magnitude can produce power by redefining the relationship between representation and embodiment. A similar dynamic unfolds within architectural environments such as St. Peter's Basilica, where scale functions not only through physical dimensions, but through the orchestration of spatial experience. The vast interior produces a condition in which the viewer's body appears diminished in relation to the surrounding structure, creating an experience of awe that aligns perception with institutional authority. The height of the dome, the repetition of columns, and the expansion of the nave generate a field in which magnitude becomes immersive, indicating that scale operates as a system that transforms space into a medium of power. The viewer, moving through such an environment, does not simply observe its size, but experiences a reorientation of perception that reflects the relationship between bodily presence and architectural magnitude. The theoretical analysis of such environments can be extended through the work of Michel Foucault, who demonstrates that spatial organization functions as a mechanism of control, structuring how individuals are positioned within systems that regulate perception and behavior. Monumental scale, in this context, operates as a visual expression of authority, ensuring that the viewer's experience aligns with structures that define power relations. The alignment between scale and institutional space reveals that magnitude is not merely aesthetic but political, functioning as a means of organizing perception within frameworks that extend beyond the individual. Yet to understand scale solely through monumentality would be to overlook the equally powerful effects produced by small-scale works, where magnitude operates through intimacy rather than dominance. In Western painting, works such as the Arnolfini portrait demonstrate how reduced scale creates a condition of close viewing that draws the observer into a field of detail, requiring sustained attention and careful observation. The viewer must approach the painting physically, altering the spatial relationship between observer and object, indicating that scale can produce a form of power that operates through proximity. The density of detail within such works creates a visual environment that rewards prolonged engagement, suggesting that small-scale functions as a mechanism that structures perception through concentration rather than expansion. This distinction between monumental and intimate scale is further articulated in the work of Svetlana Alpers, whose analysis of northern painting emphasizes that images can function as descriptive surfaces that invite prolonged examination rather than immediate comprehension. The small scale of such works does not diminish their significance, but transforms the mode of engagement, shifting from the dominance of the object to the involvement of the viewer, indicating that power can operate through attention as well as through magnitude. The viewer, engaging with these works, participates in a system that values precision and observation, suggesting that scale functions as a means of structuring how perception unfolds over time. The expansion of this analysis beyond Western contexts reveals that the relationship between scale and power operates across diverse traditions, though often through different configurations, that reflect distinct cultural frameworks. In the wall paintings and sculptural environments of Mogao caves, scale functions as an immersive system that envelops the viewer, producing a spatial condition in which perception is integrated into a larger cosmological structure. The monumental figures do not merely assert dominance, but create an environment in which the viewer's position is redefined, indicating that scale operates as a mechanism that aligns perception with systems of meaning that extend beyond the individual. At the same time, Chinese artistic traditions demonstrate that scale does not operate only through monumentality or physical smallness, but also through format, duration, and the controlled unfolding of vision. In hand scroll painting, scale is experienced horizontally and temporally rather than all at once. In Along the River, during the Qingming festival, the viewer engages with the image through a process of gradual revelation, encountering scenes that emerge sequentially as the scroll is unrolled. Its long horizontal format expands the experience of looking across time, suggesting that scale can operate through duration, continuity, and narrative accumulation, rather than through immediate magnitude alone. The viewer's movement across the scroll produces a dynamic relationship between perception and time, indicating that scale can generate complexity and depth through the structuring of experience, even when the image is not encountered as a single monumental field. A comparable interplay between scale and detail can be observed in the miniature paintings of the Mughal court, such as Jahangir, preferring a Sufi sheikh to kings, where intricate surfaces create a visual field that requires close inspection. The viewer must engage with the work at a distance that differs from that required by monumental forms, indicating that scale functions as a mechanism that shapes the conditions of viewing. The power of such works lies not in their size, but in their capacity to concentrate attention, transforming perception into a focused and sustained activity. The theoretical framework developed by Rudolf Arnheim provides further insight into how scale interacts with visual organization, demonstrating that perception is structured through principles that determine how elements are arranged within a field. Large-scale works distribute attention across expansive areas, creating immersion, while small-scale works concentrate attention, producing intensity, indicating that magnitude shapes not only what is seen, but how it is seen. This interaction between scale and attention reveals that power operates through the structuring of perception, ensuring that different magnitudes produce different modes of engagement. The experience of scale also intersects with philosophical accounts of the sublime, where magnitude exceeds the capacity for immediate comprehension, producing a condition in which perception encounters its own limits. The analysis developed by Immanuel Kant describes how overwhelming size generates a tension between sensory experience and conceptual understanding, suggesting that scale can function as a force that destabilizes perception rather than simply organizing it. The viewer, confronted with forms that exceed bodily reference, experiences a displacement that reveals the limits of perception, indicating that magnitude can produce a form of power that operates through excess. This destabilizing effect is extended in the work of Jean-François Lyotard, who emphasizes that the sublime reflects a condition in which representation fails to fully capture what is experienced, suggesting that scale can produce a gap between perception and meaning. The viewer, encountering such conditions, engages with magnitude as something that cannot be fully contained, indicating that scale operates not only as a system of control, but as a force that can disrupt coherence. The extension of scale into contemporary visual culture demonstrates that its role in structuring perception continues to evolve as cinematic and digital media manipulate size to guide attention and influence interpretation. The theoretical framework of Gilles Deleuze suggests that images operate through movement and duration, indicating that scale is not fixed, but dynamic, unfolding through sequences that shape how perception develops over time. The enlargement of the human face in close-up, for example, transforms scale into a condition that intensifies attention, while expansive landscapes create immersion, indicating that magnitude continues to function as a mechanism that organizes perception across different media. Scale establishes relationships that define how objects are perceived, positioning the viewer within a field in which magnitude determines significance, engagement, and interpretation. Monumental environments produce authority through dominance and immersion, while small-scale works generate power through intimacy and detail, revealing that magnitude operates as a variable condition that shapes perception in multiple ways. The experience of size is inseparable from the structures that define how it is encountered, ensuring that scale functions as a system that transforms measurement into meaning. The viewer, encountering scale, does not simply measure size, but experiences a reconfiguration of perception in which the relationship between body space and image is redefined, indicating that magnitude operates as a condition that shapes how the world is understood. Scale creates power because it structures the conditions under which perception occurs, positioning the viewer within a field that defines their relationship to what is seen, ensuring that magnitude functions as a mechanism that organizes attention, interpretation, and experience. The act of seeing unfolds within these conditions, revealing that size is never neutral, but always a force that shapes how the visible is encountered and understood. Time within visual experience is rarely perceived as something that is structured by the image itself, as if the duration of looking depends entirely on the viewer's willingness to remain engaged, creating the impression that attention unfolds freely, and that the length of perception is determined by individual choice rather than by the organization of what is seen. This assumption persists because the temporal dimension of perception is not immediately visible, operating through mechanisms that shape how long the viewer lingers, where attention slows, and when it moves forward, without appearing to impose control. The viewer, encountering an image, experiences the act of looking as self-directed, unaware that the distribution of visual information within the composition influences the duration of engagement, revealing that time is not external to perception, but embedded within the structure of the image. The arrangement of detail determines how attention is sustained, extended, or redirected, indicating that time within visual experience is not neutral, but constructed through the organization of elements that guide the viewer's engagement. The relationship between detail and time can be understood as a process through which the density of visual information influences the duration of perception, as areas of complexity require longer periods of observation in order to be fully apprehended, while simpler regions allow the eye to move more quickly, creating variations in the rhythm of looking that shape how the image is experienced over time. The viewer does not perceive the image in a single moment, but engages with it through a sequence that unfolds as attention moves between elements, suggesting that the temporal structure of perception is determined by the distribution of detail across the visual field. This structure creates zones of delay and acceleration, where attention is either held or released, indicating that detail functions as a mechanism that regulates the flow of perception, shaping how long the viewer remains engaged with specific parts of the image. The theoretical framework provided by Svetlana Alpers offers a critical insight into this relationship, particularly in her analysis of Northern Renaissance painting, where the density of detail produces a mode of looking that differs fundamentally from the focused compositions of Italian art. In works such as the Arnolfini portrait, the surface of the image is saturated with information, requiring the viewer to engage in a prolonged process of observation that unfolds gradually as details are discovered and interpreted. The viewer's attention is not directed toward a single focal point, but distributed across the image, creating a temporal experience that extends the act of looking, indicating that detail functions as a means of controlling the duration of perception by encouraging sustained engagement. The image does not present itself immediately, but reveals itself over time, suggesting that detail operates as a mechanism that transforms perception into a process rather than an instant. The concept of the period eye, developed by Michael Baxendale, further clarifies how detail interacts with time, as the ability to perceive and interpret visual information depends on the viewer's familiarity with the conventions that govern representation, indicating that the recognition of detail requires a form of visual literacy that shapes how the image is experienced. The viewer who possesses this literacy is able to navigate the complexity of the image more effectively, identifying patterns and meanings that might otherwise remain obscure, suggesting that the temporal dimension of perception is influenced not only by the structure of the image, but by the knowledge that the viewer brings to the encounter. The interaction between detail and perception therefore operates within a framework that integrates visual complexity with cultural and cognitive conditions, indicating that time is structured through both the organization of the image and the capacities of the viewer. The relationship between detail and attention can also be examined through the principles of perceptual psychology, as the distribution of visual information influences how attention is allocated across the image, determining which areas require extended observation and which can be processed more quickly. The work of Rudolf Arnheim emphasizes that perception is governed by the organization of visual elements, suggesting that complexity increases the cognitive effort required to process information, thereby extending the duration of engagement. The viewer, encountering areas of high detail, must invest more time in order to resolve the relationships between elements, indicating that detail functions as a mechanism that slows perception by increasing the demands placed on attention. The temporal structuring of perception through detail is further evident in the contrast between images that emphasize clarity and those that prioritize complexity, as the reduction of detail can create a sense of immediacy that allows the viewer to grasp the composition quickly, while the accumulation of detail produces a more extended engagement that unfolds gradually over time. This distinction reflects different strategies of visual organization, indicating that the amount and distribution of detail influence not only how the image is perceived, but how long it is experienced. The viewer, encountering these different conditions, adjusts the rhythm of perception accordingly, suggesting that detail functions as a means of regulating the temporal dimension of visual experience. The role of detail in controlling time extends beyond painting to sculpture, where the surface of the object provides information that shapes how the viewer engages with it. Highly detailed sculptures invite close inspection, encouraging the viewer to move around the object and explore its surface, creating a temporal experience that unfolds through physical movement, as well as visual attention. The intricate textures of works such as David reveal subtle variations that require sustained observation, indicating that detail functions as a mechanism that extends the duration of engagement by encouraging the viewer to explore the work from multiple perspectives. The relationship between detail and movement demonstrates that time in perception is not limited to visual observation, but includes the bodily experience of navigating the object, suggesting that detail operates as a condition that integrates perception and movement within a temporal framework. The manipulation of detail within composition also influences how narrative is constructed, as the distribution of visual information determines the sequence in which elements are encountered and interpreted, shaping the unfolding of meaning over time. The viewer, engaging with an image, follows paths of attention that reveal relationships between elements, suggesting that detail functions as a mechanism that organizes narrative by controlling the order and duration of perception. The alignment between detail and composition ensures that the viewer encounters the image in a way that reflects its intended structure, indicating that time is embedded within the organization of visual information. The extension of these principles into architecture further demonstrates that detail influences the temporal experience of space, as the presence of intricate ornamentation or variation in surfaces encourages slower movement and prolonged engagement, while minimal or uniform environments facilitate quicker navigation. The viewer, moving through such spaces, experiences variations in the pace of perception that reflect the distribution of detail, indicating that time is structured not only by visual complexity, but by the conditions that define how space is encountered. The analysis of detail as a structuring element can also be extended to contemporary visual culture, where the density of information in digital media influences how images are consumed, suggesting that the relationship between detail and time remains relevant across different contexts. The viewer, encountering images that vary in complexity, adjusts the duration of engagement accordingly, indicating that detail continues to function as a mechanism that regulates perception. Detail structures the temporal dimension of visual experience by determining how long the viewer remains engaged with specific elements, shaping the rhythm of perception through variations in complexity and density. The eye does not move uniformly across the image, but responds to areas that require extended observation, creating a sequence that unfolds over time, indicating that perception is not instantaneous, but processual. The distribution of detail transforms the image into a temporal structure in which attention is guided, delayed, and sustained, revealing that time within visual experience is not external, but embedded within the organization of what is seen, ensuring that perception unfolds according to patterns defined by the arrangement of visual information. The act of seeing is rarely experienced as an act of interpretation, as if images present themselves as complete and self-sufficient, allowing meaning to emerge directly from what is visible without mediation, creating the impression that understanding originates within the viewer rather than from systems that structure how visual information is organized and decoded. This impression persists because symbolic frameworks are internalized to such a degree that they disappear into the act of perception itself, allowing recognition to feel immediate and natural, while relying on conventions that determine how forms are understood. The viewer encounters an image and experiences meaning as self-evident, yet this apparent immediacy depends on prior exposure to systems that assign significance to visual elements, indicating that perception is inseparable from interpretation, and that what is seen is always already structured by relations that guide how it is understood. The symbol operates as the primary mechanism through which this structuring occurs, functioning not as a simple representation, but as a relational sign that connects the visible to systems of meaning that extend beyond the image itself. A symbol does not merely depict, but signifies, establishing associations that depend on shared knowledge and cultural frameworks, indicating that meaning is produced through systems that define how visual elements are interpreted. The viewer does not encounter a symbol as a neutral object, but as part of a network that directs thought by linking form to concept, suggesting that perception unfolds within structures that guide interpretation toward specific outcomes. This relationship transforms the image into a field of instruction, not through explicit command, but through the alignment of visual elements with symbolic systems that determine what they mean. The theoretical foundation for understanding this process is articulated by Erwin Panofsky, whose model of iconography and iconology reveals that images operate through layered systems of meaning that require knowledge beyond immediate perception. At the primary level, the viewer recognizes forms, yet recognition alone does not produce meaning, as interpretation depends on the identification of symbolic associations that connect these forms to cultural and historical frameworks. The presence of keys, for example, signifies more than an object, functioning as a reference to authority or spiritual power within Christian iconography, demonstrating that symbols guide interpretation by linking visual elements to systems of meaning that extend beyond their appearance. The viewer, engaging with such elements, interprets them according to learned conventions, indicating that perception operates within frameworks that shape how meaning is constructed. The symbolic structuring of perception can be traced to ancient Greek art, where representation is inseparable from mythological and philosophical systems that define how images are understood. The sculptural program of the Parthenon provides a clear example, as its friezes and pediments depict scenes that function as visual articulations of civic identity, divine authority, and cosmological order. The figure of Athena, represented in sculptural form, operates not as a mere depiction, but as a symbolic embodiment of wisdom, strategy, and protection, indicating that the visual form is inseparable from the conceptual framework that defines its meaning. The viewer, encountering these works, interprets them through knowledge of mythological narratives, recognizing attributes such as armor or the aegis as signs that carry specific significance, suggesting that perception is guided by symbolic systems that structure how images are understood. The development of symbolic systems within Greek art is further evident in the representation of the human body, where proportion, pose, and gesture function as signs that convey ideals of harmony, rationality, and order. The contrapposto stance, for example, signifies balance and naturalism, reflecting philosophical conceptions of the body as a site of equilibrium between opposing forces, indicating that form itself operates symbolically. The viewer does not perceive the body as neutral, but as a structured representation that conveys ideas about human nature, suggesting that symbolism operates not only through objects and attributes, but through the organization of form itself. The extension of symbolic systems into Chinese art reveals a different, but equally structured approach to meaning, as visual elements function within frameworks derived from Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist thought. The landscape painting Travelers Among Mountains and Streams exemplifies this approach, as the composition operates not as a depiction of a specific location, but as a symbolic representation of the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. Mountains signify permanence and stability, water represents change and flow, and the small human figures within the landscape indicate the relative position of humanity within a larger natural order, suggesting that meaning is constructed through the interaction of symbolic elements that reflect philosophical principles. The viewer interprets these elements through knowledge of these systems, indicating that perception is guided by frameworks that define how visual forms are understood. The symbolic use of imagery in Chinese painting extends to individual motifs, such as bamboo, which signifies resilience and moral integrity, or cranes, which represent longevity, demonstrating that symbols function as carriers of meaning that operate across different levels of representation. The viewer, encountering these motifs, interprets them according to established associations, suggesting that the act of seeing involves engagement with systems that guide interpretation through symbolic frameworks. The integration of symbolic systems within Renaissance art demonstrates a synthesis of classical and Christian traditions, as images are constructed to convey complex theological and philosophical ideas through the arrangement of visual elements. The fresco, the School of Athens, functions as a symbolic representation of intellectual history, as the positioning and gestures of figures correspond to their philosophical roles, creating a structure in which meaning is organized through relationships between elements. The central placement of Plato and Aristotle, for example, signifies their importance within the philosophical tradition, while their gestures indicate different approaches to knowledge, demonstrating that symbolism operates through both spatial arrangement and bodily expression. The continuation of symbolic systems into modern art reveals both continuity and transformation, as artists reconfigure traditional forms of representation while maintaining the use of symbols as mechanisms that guide interpretation. The painting Guernica exemplifies this shift, as fragmented forms and distorted figures function as symbols that convey the violence and chaos of war, indicating that meaning is constructed through visual elements that operate within new systems of signification. The viewer interprets these forms through historical knowledge and emotional response, suggesting that symbols continue to guide understanding even when traditional conventions are disrupted. The analysis of symbolic systems can be further extended through the semiotic framework of Roland Barthes, who emphasizes that images operate through layers of meaning that shape how they are interpreted, indicating that symbols function as part of broader systems that guide perception. The viewer engages with these systems through processes that involve both recognition and association, suggesting that meaning is constructed through the interaction between visual elements and cultural frameworks. Symbols guide interpretation by structuring how visual elements are understood, linking form to meaning in ways that shape perception and direct thought. The viewer, engaging with images, participates in systems that define how symbols operate, indicating that perception is not neutral, but guided by frameworks that determine how meaning is constructed. The image functions as a structured field in which interpretation unfolds according to relations that connect the visible to the conceptual, ensuring that understanding aligns with systems that define how the world is seen and understood. The work of Leon Battista Alberti articulates this transformation through his emphasis on painting as a structured system in which elements must be arranged according to principles that ensure clarity and intelligibility, suggesting that meaning depends on the alignment between representation and perception. Within this framework, symbols are no longer distributed arbitrarily, but positioned in ways that correspond to compositional logic, ensuring that interpretation follows paths that reflect the organization of the image. The viewer, encountering such images, is guided towards specific readings through the integration of symbolic elements within a coherent visual structure, indicating that symbolism operates in conjunction with composition to direct understanding. The painting, The Last Supper, provides a particularly clear example of this integration, as the arrangement of figures within a perspectival space organizes symbolic meaning through both spatial and gestural relationships. The central placement of Christ establishes him as the focal point, while the alignment of perspective converges toward his figure, reinforcing his symbolic role as the axis of the composition. The gestures of the apostles, arranged in groups, create a sequence of reactions that unfold across the image, indicating that meaning is constructed through the interaction of symbolic elements that guide the viewer's attention and interpretation. The viewer does not interpret these elements independently, but as part of a system that connects gesture, position, and spatial organization, suggesting that symbolism operates through the alignment of visual structure with conceptual meaning. The integration of symbolic systems within Renaissance painting extends to the representation of objects, as elements such as books, instruments, and architectural features function as signs that convey intellectual and philosophical ideas. The painting, The Ambassadors, demonstrates how objects can operate as symbols within a complex system of meaning, as the inclusion of scientific instruments, musical devices, and globes reflects the intellectual concerns of the period, indicating that the image functions as a representation of knowledge, as well as of individuals. The distorted skull in the foreground introduces a symbolic element that disrupts the coherence of the composition, functioning as a memento mori that reminds the viewer of mortality, suggesting that symbols operate not only to reinforce meaning, but to introduce tensions that complicate interpretation. The viewer, engaging with this image, must navigate a network of symbolic elements that guide understanding through both alignment and disruption, indicating that symbolism operates as a dynamic system that shapes how meaning is constructed. The theoretical framework of Michel Foucault provides a deeper understanding of how symbolic systems function within structures of knowledge, particularly in his analysis of the Renaissance episteme, where resemblance, analogy, and correspondence organize how meaning is produced. In this context, symbols operate as part of a system in which visual elements are connected through relationships that reflect broader structures of knowledge, indicating that images function as sites where meaning is constructed through networks that extend beyond the visible. The viewer, encountering such images, engages with systems that align perception with these structures, suggesting that interpretation is guided by relations that define how symbols operate within a given historical framework. The transition into the Baroque period introduces a transformation in the use of symbols as images become more dynamic, theatrical, and emotionally charged, yet continue to rely on symbolic systems that guide interpretation. The work of Caravaggio demonstrates how light, gesture, and composition are used to structure meaning through symbolic elements that direct the viewer's attention toward moments of intensity and significance. In paintings such as The Calling of St. Matthew, the use of light isolates figures and gestures that function as signs of divine intervention, indicating that symbolism operates through the manipulation of visual elements that guide perception toward specific interpretations. The viewer, encountering such images, is drawn into a system that aligns visual experience with theological meaning, suggesting that symbols function as mechanisms that direct thought through the structuring of perception. The symbolic intensity of Baroque art is further evident in the work of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, whose sculptures integrate movement, expression, and material to create forms that operate as symbolic representations of spiritual experience. The sculpture Ecstasy of Saint Teresa exemplifies this approach, as the depiction of the saint in a state of rapture functions as a symbol of divine encounter, indicating that the representation of the body is inseparable from the conceptual framework that defines its meaning. The viewer, encountering this work, interprets the physical form through symbolic associations that connect the visible to the spiritual, suggesting that symbolism operates through the transformation of sensory experience into conceptual understanding. The expansion of symbolic systems during this period reflects the increasing complexity of visual culture, as images are constructed to address audiences with varying levels of knowledge and interpretive capacity, indicating that symbols must operate across multiple levels of meaning. The viewer engages with these images through processes that involve both immediate recognition and deeper interpretation, suggesting that symbolism functions as a layered system that guides understanding through both accessibility and complexity. The extension of symbolic systems into early modern contexts demonstrates that meaning continues to be structured through visual elements that guide interpretation, even as representation becomes more varied and experimental. The work of Rembrandt illustrates how symbolism can operate through subtlety and ambiguity, as the use of light, expression, and composition creates images that invite interpretation while resisting fixed meaning. The viewer, engaging with such works, participates in a process of interpretation that unfolds over time, suggesting that symbols function not only to direct thought, but to shape the experience of uncertainty and reflection. The continuity between Renaissance and Baroque symbolic systems reveals that the image functions as a structured field in which meaning is constructed through the interaction of visual elements that guide perception and interpretation. The viewer does not encounter these images as neutral representations, but as systems that direct thought through the organization of symbols, indicating that perception is shaped by frameworks that define how meaning is produced. The transformation of these systems across periods reflects changes in how knowledge is organized and communicated, suggesting that symbols operate as mechanisms that align perception with the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual structures that define how the world is understood. The transition into modernity does not eliminate symbolic systems, but destabilizes them, altering the conditions under which as meaning is produced and interpreted by disrupting the coherence that previously aligned visual representation with established frameworks of knowledge. The viewer no longer encounters images that operate within stable systems of shared meaning, but enters a field in which symbols become fragmented, ambiguous, and open to multiple interpretations, creating the impression that meaning is no longer fixed, but contingent upon individual perception. This shift does not result in the disappearance of symbolic control, but in its transformation, as the structures that guide interpretation become less visible, operating through instability rather than coherence, suggesting that the act of seeing continues to be directed even as it appears to become more open and indeterminate. The work of Edouard Manet marks a critical moment in this transformation, as his paintings disrupt the symbolic conventions that previously governed representation by presenting figures and objects without the contextual frameworks that ensured stable interpretation. In Olympia, the figure is stripped of mythological or allegorical justification, confronting the viewer directly without the symbolic systems that would traditionally mediate her presence, indicating that meaning is no longer secured through established conventions. The viewer is left to interpret the image without the guidance of a stable symbolic framework. Yet this apparent openness does not produce freedom, but uncertainty, suggesting that the collapse of traditional symbols introduces new conditions in which interpretation becomes more complex and less predictable. The theoretical implications of this shift can be understood through the work of Charles Baudelaire, whose reflections on modernity emphasize the fragmentation of experience and the loss of stable frameworks that previously structured perception. In this context, symbols no longer function as fixed carriers of meaning, but as elements within a system that is constantly changing, indicating that interpretation becomes an active process in which the viewer must negotiate between multiple possibilities. The image does not provide a clear path for understanding, but presents a field of ambiguity that requires engagement, suggesting that symbolic systems continue to guide thought, but in ways that are less immediately apparent. The emergence of abstraction further complicates the relationship between symbols and meaning, as artists such as Wassily Kandinsky reject representational forms in favor of compositions that rely on color, line, and rhythm to produce meaning, indicating that symbols can operate independently of recognizable objects. In works such as Composition 7, the viewer encounters a visual field in which meaning is not derived from identifiable forms, but from the relationships between elements, suggesting that symbolism is reconfigured as a system that operates through abstraction. The absence of clear reference does not eliminate meaning, but transforms it, requiring the viewer to engage with the image through new frameworks that interpret visual elements as expressive or conceptual rather than representational, indicating that symbolic systems adapt to new conditions while continuing to guide perception. The analysis of modern symbolic systems can be further developed through the work of Sigmund Freud, whose theories of the unconscious reveal that symbols operate not only at the level of cultural convention, but within the structure of the mind itself, suggesting that images can evoke meanings that are not immediately accessible to conscious interpretation. The incorporation of these ideas into art, particularly within surrealism, demonstrates how symbols can function as mechanisms that reveal hidden or repressed aspects of experience, indicating that interpretation is shaped by processes that extend beyond rational understanding. The work of Salvador Dali exemplifies this approach, as images such as The Persistence of Memory employ symbolic elements that resist straightforward interpretation, suggesting that meaning operates through associations that are not fixed, but fluid, indicating that symbols guide thought through structures that are both visible and concealed. The development of semiotic theory in the 20th century provides a framework for understanding how symbolic systems continue to structure meaning even in contexts where traditional conventions have been disrupted. The work of Roland Barthes emphasizes that images operate as systems of signs that produce meaning through codes that are often naturalized, making them appear self-evident, while relying on cultural frameworks that guide interpretation. His analysis of myth demonstrates how symbols function to reinforce ideologies by presenting constructed meanings as natural, indicating that symbolic systems continue to shape perception, even when they are not recognized as such. The viewer, encountering images within modern visual culture, engages with systems that direct thought through the organization of signs, suggesting that interpretation remains structured by relations that define how meaning is produced. The work of Marcel Duchamp introduces a further transformation in the operation of symbols, as the presentation of everyday objects within the context of art challenges the distinction between representation and reality, indicating that meaning is not inherent in objects, but produced through the frameworks that define how they are interpreted. The ready-made fountain exemplifies this shift, as the object acquires symbolic significance not through its form but through its placement within a system that redefines its meaning, suggesting that symbols operate through context as well as through representation. The viewer, encountering such works, must interpret them within frameworks that extend beyond traditional symbolic systems, indicating that meaning is constructed through relations that redefine how objects are understood. The expansion of symbolic systems into contemporary art reflects the increasing complexity of visual culture, as images operate within networks that include media, technology, and global exchange, indicating that symbols function across multiple contexts simultaneously. The work of Ai Weiwei demonstrates how symbols can be used to address political and social issues, as objects and installations are transformed into signs that critique systems of power and authority. The viewer, engaging with such works, interprets them through knowledge of contemporary contexts, suggesting that symbolism continues to function as a mechanism that guides thought by connecting visual elements to broader frameworks of meaning. The persistence of symbolic systems across historical periods reveals that the image functions as a structured field in which meaning is constructed through the interaction of visual elements that guide perception and interpretation. The apparent fragmentation of modern and contemporary art does not eliminate symbolic control, but reconfigures it, creating conditions in which meaning is less stable, but still directed, indicating that the viewer remains positioned within systems that shape how images are understood. The shift from coherence to ambiguity introduces new forms of engagement, suggesting that symbols continue to operate as mechanisms that guide thought, even as they resist fixed interpretation. The viewer, encountering images across different periods and cultures, participates in systems that define how symbols operate, indicating that perception is shaped by frameworks that determine how meaning is constructed. The transformation of symbolic systems reflects changes in how knowledge is organized and communicated, yet the underlying structure remains, revealing that images continue to direct thought through the organization of visual elements that connect the visible to the conceptual. The experience of seeing, therefore, is not an encounter with neutral forms, but an engagement with systems that guide interpretation, ensuring that meaning is shaped by relations that extend beyond the image itself. The act of seeing is conditioned by expectations that precede perception, shaping how the visible is recognized and evaluated before it is consciously interpreted, creating the impression that judgment emerges naturally from what is seen while relying on frameworks that determine what is considered correct, harmonious, or meaningful. These expectations do not present themselves as external structures, but operate as internalized standards that guide perception without appearing to constrain it, allowing the viewer to experience recognition as immediate, while aligning with systems that define how forms should appear. The image is encountered within a field, structured by these standards, indicating that perception is not an open engagement with the visible, but an activity shaped by ideals that determine how meaning is constructed and how visual information is evaluated. The concept of the ideal functions as a structuring condition, rather than a descriptive category, establishing models that define how forms should be organized and how relationships between elements should be perceived, suggesting that the visible is understood in relation to standards that exist prior to observation. The philosophical articulation of this structure can be traced to Plato, whose theory of forms establishes that recognition depends on alignment between the material world and ideal models that define its intelligibility, indicating that perception is guided by frameworks that determine how the visible relates to concepts of truth and order. The viewer does not encounter the image without reference, but interprets it through these frameworks, suggesting that expectation operates as a condition that shapes how the visible is understood. The articulation of ideal proportion within ancient Greek art extends beyond well-known canonical sculptures into works such as the Curator's Boy, where the subtle shift of weight introduces a refined balance that reflects an emerging conception of the body as an integrated system of relationships, rather than a rigid form. The viewer perceives this balance as natural, yet this perception depends on alignment with principles that define how equilibrium should appear, indicating that expectation is shaped by ideals that structure how the body is understood. Similarly, the architectural refinement of the Temple of Hephaestus demonstrates how proportion and symmetry create a sense of stability that appears inherent while relying on calculated adjustments that align perception with idealized order, suggesting that expectation is constructed through systems that define how harmony is perceived. Roman art extends these principles through a different engagement with the ideal, as works such as the Augustus of Prima Porta combine idealized form with political symbolism, presenting the ruler not as he appears but as he should be perceived within a system that defines authority through visual perfection. The viewer interprets the figure through frameworks that align physical form with conceptual ideals of power and legitimacy, indicating that expectation operates as a condition that shapes how authority is recognized. The integration of idealization with representation demonstrates that the ideal functions not only as an aesthetic principle, but as a mechanism that structures perception in relation to social and political frameworks. The structuring role of the ideal within Chinese art reveals a distinct conceptual orientation, as the ideal is not defined through fixed proportion, but through relational harmony that reflects cosmological principles. The hand scroll along the river during the Qingming festival constructs a visual field in which the organization of figures, architecture, and landscape reflects a dynamic equilibrium that guides the viewer's perception across the composition, suggesting that expectation is shaped by systems that define how balance operates within movement and variation. The viewer does not interpret the image as a static arrangement, but as a continuous unfolding of relationships, indicating that the ideal functions as a temporal as well as spatial condition that shapes how the visible is understood. Japanese art further transforms the operation of the ideal through the emphasis on asymmetry and impermanence, as seen in works such as The Great Wave of Kanagawa, where the composition balances dynamic movement with structural coherence, suggesting that the ideal is not defined by stability, but by the tension between forces that create visual equilibrium. The viewer perceives the image as balanced, despite its apparent instability, indicating that expectation is shaped by systems that redefine how harmony is constructed. The concept of wabi-sabi introduces an additional dimension in which imperfection and transience function as conditions of beauty, suggesting that the ideal can operate through deviation from symmetry rather than adherence to it. The articulation of the ideal within Indian art reflects a synthesis of aesthetic and metaphysical principles, as seen in the sculptural programs of sites such as Khajuraho temples, where the representation of the human form follows canonical systems that define proportion and gesture in relation to spiritual concepts. The viewer interprets these forms through frameworks that align physical representation with metaphysical meaning, indicating that expectation is shaped by ideals that connect the visible to broader conceptual structures. The repetition and variation of forms within these contexts create a sense of order that reflects an underlying system, suggesting that the ideal operates as a condition that structures perception through alignment with philosophical principles. Islamic art introduces a further transformation, as the ideal is expressed through geometric and calligraphic systems that emphasize unity and infinite extension, rather than figurative representation. The intricate tile work of the Alhambra demonstrates how patterns operate as visual articulations of order that extend beyond the individual surface, suggesting that the ideal functions as a condition that shapes perception through repetition and variation. The viewer experiences harmony as an effect of alignment with these systems, indicating that expectation is structured through principles that define how order is constructed within abstraction. The Renaissance reconfigures the ideal through the integration of classical principles with new approaches to representation, as seen in works such as The Birth of Venus, where the figure is constructed according to ideals that depart from strict naturalism in favor of a refined elegance that reflects aesthetic and philosophical considerations. The viewer perceives the figure as harmonious, despite deviations from anatomical accuracy, indicating that expectation is shaped by standards that define how beauty is constructed. The ideal operates here as a selective system that prioritizes certain qualities over others, suggesting that perception is guided by frameworks that determine how form is evaluated. Northern Renaissance art offers a contrasting approach, as works such as The Garden of Earthly Delights present complex visual fields in which symbolic and detailed elements create a dense network of meaning that shapes how the viewer engages with the image over time. The ideal here does not manifest as simplified harmony, but as an intricate system that organizes perception through complexity, indicating that expectation is structured by frameworks that define how meaning is constructed through detail and variation. The transformation of the ideal within modern art reflects a shift in how expectation operates, as artists challenge established standards by presenting forms that disrupt conventional frameworks. The work of Kazimir Malevich, particularly in Black Square, removes representational content entirely, suggesting that the ideal can be redefined through abstraction that prioritizes conceptual over visual correspondence. The viewer interprets such works through frameworks that have been expanded to accommodate new forms of meaning, indicating that expectation adapts to new conditions while continuing to guide perception. The persistence of the ideal within contemporary art demonstrates that expectation continues to shape how images are understood, even as the diversity of forms increases. The installations of Yayoi Kusama, with their repetitive patterns and immersive environments, create spaces in which perception is structured through systems that guide how the viewer experiences scale, infinity, and repetition, indicating that the ideal operates as a condition that shapes how the visible is encountered within new contexts. Expectation functions as a structuring force that aligns perception with ideals that define how the visible should appear, guiding interpretation through frameworks that determine how forms are evaluated and understood. The viewer engages with images through these frameworks, often without recognizing their influence, suggesting that perception is shaped by systems that define how meaning is constructed. The ideal operates not as an external standard, but as an internalized condition that shapes how the world is seen, revealing that the act of seeing is guided by structures that align perception with models that determine how the visible is understood. The experience of looking is often understood as an act of freedom, as if the viewer approaches an image with the ability to decide where to look, what to focus on, and how long to remain engaged, creating the impression that perception unfolds according to personal intention rather than external structure. This assumption depends on the belief that attention is self-directed, that the eye moves independently of constraint, and that interpretation arises from individual judgment rather than from systems that organize how visual information is encountered. Yet this sense of freedom is sustained precisely because the mechanisms that guide perception remain concealed, operating through structures that shape how attention is distributed without appearing to impose control, indicating that the act of looking is not an open exploration, but an engagement with conditions that determine how choice is experienced. The illusion of choice emerges from the alignment between the viewer's sense of agency and the structures that guide perception, creating a condition in which the viewer experiences decision-making as autonomous, while responding to patterns that have already been established within the image. The eye does not move randomly, but follows paths that are embedded within the composition, drawn toward areas of contrast, guided by directional lines, and stabilized by focal points that organize how the image is encountered over time, suggesting that perception unfolds within a system that channels attention along predetermined routes. The viewer, unaware of these conditions, interprets their own movement as self-directed, indicating that the experience of choice is constructed through the concealment of the structures that guide it. The theoretical framework provided by Michel Foucault offers a critical lens through which this condition can be understood, particularly in his analysis of power as something that operates not through direct coercion, but through the organization of environments that shape behavior, while preserving the appearance of freedom. Within this framework, the image functions as a field in which perception is guided through arrangements that direct attention without restricting it explicitly, suggesting that control is most effective when it remains invisible. The viewer does not experience limitation, but orientation, indicating that the illusion of choice depends on the alignment between perceived freedom and structured guidance. The operation of this illusion can be observed in ancient Greek vase painting, where narrative scenes are arranged in ways that guide the viewer's attention across the surface through the positioning of figures and the direction of gestures. In works such as Achilles and Ajax playing a board game, the composition directs attention toward the central interaction between the figures, while secondary elements reinforce this focus through alignment and repetition, indicating that the viewer's gaze is structured by relationships that determine how the scene is interpreted. The viewer experiences the act of looking as a process of discovery, yet this process follows paths that have been constructed within the image, suggesting that choice operates within limits defined by compositional organization. The structuring of perception through guided attention is further evident in Chinese hand-scroll painting, where the format itself creates a temporal sequence that determines how the image is encountered. In works such as Dwelling in the Fujian Mountains, the viewer does not see the entire composition at once, but unfolds it gradually, engaging with the image through a controlled progression that directs attention across the landscape. The experience of movement through the image appears to be guided by the viewer's actions, yet the sequence of perception is structured by the format, indicating that the illusion of choice emerges from the alignment between physical interaction and compositional design. The concept of guided perception can also be understood through the analysis of visual attention developed by Rudolf Arnheim, who emphasizes that the organization of visual elements determines how attention is distributed, suggesting that perception is governed by forces that shape how the eye moves within the image. These forces operate through contrast, balance, and direction, creating patterns that guide attention towards specific areas, indicating that the viewer's experience of choice is structured by the arrangement of elements that influence how perception unfolds. The illusion of choice becomes particularly evident in Renaissance painting, where perspective organizes the image in a way that positions the viewer within a fixed system that determines how space is perceived. The painting, The Flagellation of Christ, demonstrates how architectural space and perspectival alignment guide the viewer's attention towards specific areas, creating a hierarchy that structures interpretation. The viewer may believe that they are free to explore the image, yet the organization of space directs attention along paths that emphasize particular relationships, indicating that choice operates within constraints defined by the structure of the image. The manipulation of attention through composition continues into Islamic art, where geometric patterns create visual fields that guide the eye through repetition and variation, suggesting that perception unfolds according to rhythms that are embedded within the design. The intricate tilework of the Shah Mosque demonstrates how patterns extend across surfaces in ways that direct the viewer's gaze, creating an experience of movement that appears exploratory while following paths defined by the organization of elements, indicating that the illusion of choice operates through the alignment between perception and structure. The extension of these principles into modern art reveals that the illusion of choice persists even as representational systems are disrupted, as artists continue to guide perception through new forms of organization. The composition of Broadway Boogie Woogie directs attention through a grid of lines and color blocks that create rhythms guiding the eye across the surface, suggesting that perception is structured through relationships that determine how the image is encountered. The viewer experiences movement as spontaneous, yet it follows patterns that are embedded within the composition, indicating that choice remains guided even within abstraction. The illusion of choice is not limited to static images, but extends to sculptural and spatial environments, where the arrangement of elements determines how the viewer moves and where attention is directed. The installation work of Olafur Eliasson, particularly in environments such as the Weather Project, creates spaces in which light, scale, and atmosphere guide the viewer's movement and perception, suggesting that the experience of exploration is structured by conditions that define how space is encountered. The viewer perceives their movement as self-directed, yet it is shaped by the organization of the environment, indicating that the illusion of choice operates across different forms of visual experience. The persistence of this illusion across cultures and historical periods demonstrates that the act of looking is consistently structured by systems that guide attention while preserving the appearance of freedom, indicating that perception is not an open field, but a directed process that aligns the viewer with patterns that determine how images are experienced. The viewer does not encounter images as neutral spaces, but as structured environments in which attention is guided, suggesting that the experience of choice is constructed through the alignment between perception and the systems that organize it. The illusion of choice reveals that perception is shaped by conditions that guide attention while concealing their own operation, ensuring that the viewer experiences looking as a self-directed activity while engaging with structures that determine how the image is encountered. The act of seeing is therefore not an expression of unrestricted freedom, but an interaction with systems that channel attention along paths that have already been constructed, indicating that choice operates within limits defined by the organization of visual information. The viewer moves through the image, yet this movement follows trajectories that have been embedded within its structure, revealing that the experience of freedom depends on the invisibility of the forces that guide it. The experience of choice does not disappear when options increase but becomes more complex, as the presence of multiple possibilities creates the impression of freedom while remaining structured by conditions that determine how those possibilities are understood and selected. The viewer, encountering an image rich in detail, variation, or narrative elements, perceives an expanded field of engagement, in which attention can move freely between different points, suggesting that interpretation unfolds through a process of exploration rather than direction. Yet this apparent openness often masks a deeper level of control, as the organization of these elements establishes relationships that guide perception toward specific outcomes, indicating that variation does not eliminate structure, but operates within it, shaping how the viewer navigates the image, while preserving the appearance of autonomy. The multiplication of visual elements creates a field in which attention appears to be distributed rather than concentrated, allowing the viewer to move between details, figures, and zones of activity. Yet this distribution is rarely neutral, as the arrangement of elements establishes hierarchies that influence how attention is allocated. The viewer may choose where to look, but this choice occurs within a system that defines which areas attract attention more strongly, which relationships are emphasized, and which paths of movement are more likely to be followed, suggesting that variation functions as a mechanism that expands the field of perception while maintaining control over its structure. The illusion of choice emerges not from the absence of direction, but from the presence of multiple pathways that converge towards similar interpretive outcomes. This condition can be observed in the dense narrative compositions of Mughal painting, where scenes are filled with figures, architecture, and decorative detail that invite close inspection while organizing attention through compositional strategies that guide interpretation. In works such as Akbar reviewing the troops, the viewer encounters a multiplicity of figures and actions, yet the hierarchical arrangement of scale, color, and position directs attention toward the central figure of the emperor, indicating that the apparent abundance of detail operates within a structure that reinforces a specific reading of authority and order. The viewer experiences the image as a space of exploration, yet the distribution of elements ensures that interpretation aligns with the intended emphasis, suggesting that variation serves to enhance engagement while maintaining control over meaning. A similar structuring of perception can be found in medieval European manuscripts, where illuminated pages present intricate compositions filled with symbolic imagery, decorative patterns, and narrative scenes that create a rich visual field. The Lindisfarne Gospels exemplifies how complexity and ornamentation invite sustained attention, encouraging the viewer to move between elements while guiding interpretation through the integration of text and image. The viewer engages with the page through a process of discovery, yet this process unfolds within a framework that aligns visual and textual meaning, indicating that variation does not produce interpretive freedom, but operates as a mechanism that structures how the image is read. The theoretical implications of this condition can be understood through the work of Pierre Bourdieu, whose analysis of cultural systems demonstrates that choice operates within fields, defined by structures that shape preferences and perceptions, suggesting that what appears as individual selection is influenced by conditions that determine how options are evaluated. Applied to visual experience, this framework reveals that the viewer's movement within an image is guided by patterns that influence attention, indicating that variation does not eliminate constraint, but reconfigures it, allowing the viewer to experience choice while operating within systems that shape how that choice is exercised. The structuring of perception through variation is further evident in African sculptural traditions, where the repetition of forms and patterns creates visual systems that guide interpretation through rhythm and variation. The masks of the Yoruba culture, for example, present variations within established forms that convey different meanings while maintaining a coherent structure, indicating that the viewer interprets these differences within a framework that defines how variation operates. The mask Yoruba Gelede mask demonstrates how changes in form, color, and detail create distinct identities while adhering to conventions that guide interpretation, suggesting that variation functions as a mechanism that expands expressive possibilities without dissolving the structures that shape meaning. The operation of constraint within variation becomes particularly evident in Baroque art, where dynamic compositions and complex arrangements create a sense of movement and multiplicity while directing attention through carefully constructed relationships. The painting Las Meninas exemplifies how multiple points of focus and layered perspectives create an intricate visual field that invites exploration, yet the positioning of figures, the direction of gazes, and the use of light guide the viewer towards specific interpretations, indicating that the apparent openness of the composition operates within a system that structures how the image is understood. The viewer moves through the image as if navigating freely, yet this movement follows paths that have been embedded within its structure, suggesting that variation functions as a means of guiding perception while maintaining the illusion of choice. The extension of this principle into East Asian screen painting reveals how repetition and variation create visual systems that structure perception across large surfaces, as seen in works such as Pine Tree Screen, where the repetition of forms creates a rhythm that guides the viewer's gaze across the composition. The viewer experiences movement through the image as a process of exploration, yet this movement is shaped by patterns that determine how attention is distributed, indicating that variation operates within a system that structures perception while allowing for the experience of freedom. The illusion of choice becomes increasingly complex in modern visual culture, where the proliferation of images and the expansion of visual fields create conditions in which viewers encounter multiple layers of information simultaneously, suggesting that perception operates within environments that encourage exploration while guiding interpretation through design. The collage works of Hannah Höch, for example, present fragmented compositions that appear to offer multiple interpretive possibilities, yet the arrangement of elements establishes relationships that shape how meaning is constructed, indicating that variation functions as a mechanism that structures interpretation, even within seemingly chaotic systems. The persistence of this condition across different cultural and historical contexts demonstrates that the illusion of choice is not dependent on the absence of structure, but on its concealment within systems that expand the field of perception while maintaining control over its organization. The viewer encounters images that appear to offer multiple paths of engagement, yet these paths are shaped by relationships that guide attention towards specific outcomes, indicating that choice operates within frameworks that define how variation is structured. The multiplication of possibilities does not produce freedom, but transforms the nature of constraint, allowing the viewer to experience selection as autonomous while operating within systems that shape how options are perceived and evaluated. The image functions as a structured field in which variation creates the appearance of openness, yet this openness is organized through relationships that determine how perception unfolds, suggesting that the illusion of choice emerges from the alignment between the expansion of possibilities and the persistence of underlying structures that guide interpretation. The transformation of symbolic and perceptual systems in the modern and contemporary world does not dissolve the structures that guide interpretation, but refines them, embedding control within environments that are increasingly responsive, adaptive, and immersive, creating conditions in which the viewer's sense of agency is intensified, while the mechanisms that shape it become more difficult to detect. The experience of choice expands as the number of visible options increases, yet this expansion operates within systems that anticipate, guide, and regulate perception, indicating that freedom is not removed, but engineered, suggesting that the act of looking becomes an interaction with structures that respond to the viewer while directing how that response unfolds. The emergence of modern exhibition design provides an early indication of this transformation, as museums begin to organize artworks in ways that shape how viewers move through space and encounter images, creating sequences that guide perception through spatial arrangement. The viewer navigates galleries that appear open and accessible, yet the placement of works, the direction of movement, and the relationships between objects structure how the experience unfolds, indicating that the act of viewing is shaped by conditions that determine how attention is distributed over time. The museum does not impose a single path, but creates an environment in which certain paths are more likely to be followed, suggesting that choice operates within a system that guides movement while preserving the appearance of autonomy. The installation's spiral jetty introduces a further dimension in which the viewer's movement through space becomes integral to the experience of the work, as the spiral form directs the path that the viewer takes, while allowing for variations in how that path is navigated. The viewer experiences the movement as self-directed, yet the structure of the work determines the trajectory of engagement, indicating that choice operates within a framework that defines how space is encountered. The alignment between physical movement and spatial design demonstrates that the illusion of choice extends beyond visual perception into embodied experience, suggesting that the viewer participates in systems that guide action as well as attention. The development of participatory and interactive art further complicates the relationship between choice and control, as works are designed to respond to the viewer's presence, creating the impression that the image or environment is shaped by individual interaction. The installations of Raphael Lozano Hema, such as Pulse Room, allow viewers to influence visual outcomes through their own biological signals, suggesting that the artwork is co-created through interaction. Yet this interaction operates within parameters that define how the system responds, indicating that the viewer's choices are structured by conditions that determine the range of possible outcomes. The experience of agency is heightened, yet it remains contained within a system that shapes how interaction unfolds, suggesting that the illusion of choice becomes more persuasive as the system becomes more responsive. The theoretical implications of this condition can be understood through the work of Gilles Deleuze, whose analysis of control societies emphasizes that power operates through modulation rather than restriction, shaping behavior by creating environments that adapt to the individual while guiding action within defined parameters. Within this framework, the viewer does not encounter fixed structures, but dynamic systems that adjust in response to engagement, suggesting that control is exercised through flexibility rather than rigidity. The image or environment becomes a field in which perception is continuously shaped by interactions that align the viewer's actions with the system's logic, indicating that choice is structured through processes that operate in real time. The expansion of digital media intensifies this condition, as images are presented within interfaces that guide attention through design elements such as layout, color, and interaction patterns, creating environments in which the viewer navigates information through systems that prioritize certain paths over others. The grid-based compositions of contemporary visual platforms resemble earlier, compositional strategies, yet operate at a scale and speed that transforms how perception is structured, indicating that the illusion of choice becomes embedded within everyday visual experience. The viewer scrolls, selects, and navigates, experiencing each action as a decision, yet these decisions are shaped by systems that determine visibility, sequence, and emphasis, suggesting that perception operates within environments that guide attention through design. The work of Hito Steyerl addresses this condition by examining how images circulate within digital networks, emphasizing that visibility itself is structured by systems that determine what is seen and how it is encountered. The viewer engages with images that appear within curated streams, experiencing selection as personal choice, while responding to structures that organize how content is presented, indicating that the illusion of choice extends beyond individual images into the broader systems that define visual culture. The persistence of these structures across different forms of art and media demonstrates that the illusion of choice is not an accidental feature of perception, but a fundamental condition through which visual systems operate, guiding attention, shaping interpretation, and directing engagement while preserving the appearance of freedom. The viewer moves through images, spaces, and interfaces as if navigating independently. Yet this movement unfolds within frameworks that define how perception is structured, indicating that choice is experienced rather than exercised in a fully autonomous sense. The relationship between choice and control becomes most evident when the viewer begins to recognize the patterns that guide perception, revealing that what appears as freedom is shaped by systems that determine how attention is directed and how meaning is constructed. This recognition does not eliminate the influence of these systems, but transforms the experience of seeing, allowing the viewer to engage with images in a way that acknowledges the structures that guide interpretation. The act of looking becomes a reflective process in which perception is understood as an interaction with systems that shape how the world is seen. The illusion of choice does not depend on the absence of structure, but on its invisibility, ensuring that the viewer experiences perception as self-directed while engaging with frameworks that guide attention and interpretation. The image functions as a field in which choice is structured through relationships that determine how perception unfolds, indicating that freedom operates within limits defined by the organization of visual information. The viewer moves through this field, making decisions that feel autonomous, yet these decisions align with paths that have been embedded within the structure of the image, revealing that the experience of choice is constructed through the alignment between perception and the systems that guide it. The structures that guide perception do not remain uncontested, as artists across different periods and cultural contexts have sought to disrupt the systems that organize how images are seen, interpreted, and understood, producing works that resist coherence, undermine expectation, and challenge the frameworks that align perception with established forms of meaning. These attempts do not operate outside of structure, but engage directly with it, exposing the mechanisms that guide perception by interrupting the conditions that sustain their invisibility, suggesting that the act of breaking control involves not the elimination of structure, but its transformation into something that can be perceived, questioned, and reconfigured. The viewer, encountering such works, is no longer guided seamlessly through a system that produces coherence, but confronted with conditions that disrupt recognition, delay interpretation, and destabilize meaning, indicating that perception becomes an active process in which the viewer must negotiate the absence of familiar frameworks. The impulse to disrupt visual control emerges in different forms, often through the refusal of conventions that organize how images are constructed and interpreted, as artists seek to challenge the alignment between representation and expectation that stabilizes meaning. The work of Edouard Manet provides an early instance of this disruption, as paintings such as A Bar at the Folies Bergère present scenes that resist coherent spatial interpretation, creating ambiguities that prevent the viewer from locating themselves within a stable perspective. The reflection in the mirror does not align with the position of the viewer, producing a disjunction that interrupts the continuity of perception, indicating that the image no longer functions as a transparent system, but as a site of instability. The viewer must reconcile conflicting visual information, suggesting that perception is no longer guided through a singular path, but fragmented into multiple possibilities that resist resolution. The theoretical implications of such disruptions can be understood through the work of Jacques Derrida, whose analysis of deconstruction emphasizes that meaning is not fixed, but produced through differences that prevent closure, suggesting that attempts to stabilize interpretation are always subject to interruption within this framework. Artworks that disrupt visual control do not simply negate meaning, but reveal its instability, indicating that perception operates within systems that can be unsettled by exposing their internal contradictions. The viewer, encountering such works, engages with images that resist definitive interpretation, suggesting that the act of seeing becomes a process of negotiation rather than recognition. The fragmentation of form within early 20th century art intensifies this disruption, as movements such as Cubism dismantle the coherence of perspective and representation, presenting objects from multiple viewpoints simultaneously, thereby challenging the assumption that perception operates from a fixed position. The work of Pablo Picasso, particularly in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, exemplifies this approach, as the figures are constructed through fractured planes that resist integration into a unified spatial system. The viewer cannot reconstruct a stable perspective, but must engage with the image as a field of discontinuities, indicating that perception is no longer guided by systems that produce coherence, but by structures that emphasize fragmentation. The breakdown of perspective reveals that the conditions that previously structured perception are not inherent but constructed, suggesting that control can be challenged by exposing its mechanisms. The disruption of visual control is also evident in Dada, where the rejection of conventional meaning leads to the creation of works that undermine the relationship between representation and interpretation. The ready-mades of Marcel Duchamp, such as Bicycle Wheel, remove objects from their functional contexts and present them within the space of art, disrupting the frameworks that define how they are understood. The viewer encounters the object without the systems that would normally guide interpretation, suggesting that meaning is not inherent but dependent on context, indicating that the act of seeing can be destabilized by altering the conditions that define how objects are perceived. The challenge to visual control extends beyond Western traditions, as artists in other cultural contexts engage with systems of representation in ways that disrupt established frameworks. In Japanese avant-garde art, the Gutai group sought to break the boundaries between material, action, and perception, producing works that emphasize process and immediacy rather than stable form. The performances and material experiments of Kazuo Shiraga, in which paint is applied through physical movement rather than controlled technique, create images that resist conventional composition, suggesting that the act of creation itself becomes a means of disrupting the structures that guide perception. The viewer encounters traces of action rather than representations of form, indicating that meaning is not stabilized through composition, but remains open to interpretation. The disruption of control is further evident in African contemporary art, where artists engage with both traditional and modern visual systems to challenge the frameworks that define how identity and representation are constructed. The photographic work of Samuel Fosso, for example, uses self-portraiture to adopt multiple identities, destabilizing the relationship between image and subject, suggesting that representation can be reconfigured to challenge expectations. The viewer, encountering these images, must navigate shifting identities that resist fixed interpretation, indicating that perception is not guided by stable symbolic systems, but by structures that emphasize transformation. The integration of disruption into spatial and installation art further transforms how control operates, as environments are constructed to alter the viewer's experience of space, time, and perception. The installations of James Turrell create spaces in which light becomes a material that dissolves boundaries, making it difficult for the viewer to distinguish between surface and depth, indicating that perception is destabilized through the manipulation of sensory conditions. The viewer, entering such environments, experiences a loss of orientation that challenges the frameworks that normally guide perception, suggesting that control can be disrupted by altering the conditions that define how space is understood. The work of Yoko Ono introduces a different approach to breaking control, as instruction-based works invite the viewer to participate in the creation of the artwork, shifting the role of authorship and interpretation. In works such as Cut Piece, the viewer becomes an active participant, making decisions that influence the outcome of the work, suggesting that control is redistributed rather than eliminated. Yet even within this redistribution, the structure of the work defines the conditions under which participation occurs. indicating that the attempt to break control operates within frameworks that continue to shape how the experience unfolds. The persistence of structure within attempts to disrupt control reveals that the relationship between freedom and constraint is not binary, but relational, as the breakdown of one system often gives rise to another that reorganizes perception in new ways. The viewer, encountering works that resist traditional frameworks, engages with images that require active interpretation, suggesting that perception becomes more conscious of its own conditions. The disruption of control does not eliminate the structures that guide perception, but makes them visible, transforming the act of seeing into an awareness of the systems that shape it. The attempt to break control therefore reveals the extent to which perception depends on the structures that organize it, as the absence of familiar frameworks produces conditions in which meaning becomes unstable, requiring the viewer to engage with images in new ways. The viewer does not simply experience freedom, but encounters the limits of perception, suggesting that the act of seeing is always situated within systems that define how the visible is understood. The image becomes a site in which these systems are both challenged and reconfigured, indicating that control is not removed, but transformed through processes that expose its mechanisms. The disruption of visual control ultimately reveals that perception is not an autonomous activity, but an engagement with structures that shape how the world is seen, suggesting that the attempt to break control leads to a deeper awareness of the conditions that define visual experience. The viewer, encountering such works, becomes aware of the frameworks that guide perception, recognizing that the act of seeing is shaped by systems that can be questioned, altered, and reimagined, indicating that the possibility of freedom lies not in the absence of structure, but in the ability to perceive and engage with the structures that define how meaning is constructed. The structures that guide perception are often understood through their visibility, as if control operates through identifiable systems such as composition, perspective, symbolism, or spatial organization, allowing the viewer to recognize how images direct attention and shape interpretation. These systems can be analyzed, described, and even resisted, suggesting that control depends on the presence of forms that structure how the image is encountered. Yet there exists a more subtle condition in which control persists without relying on clearly defined structures, operating through atmospheres, expectations, and internalized patterns that shape perception without appearing as external constraints, creating the impression that the viewer is free precisely because no system is immediately visible. This condition does not eliminate control, but relocates it, embedding it within the processes of perception itself, indicating that the act of seeing is guided not only by what is constructed within the image, but by what has already been absorbed by the viewer. The absence of visible structure does not produce neutrality, but introduces a different form of organization in which perception is guided through conditions that operate below the level of conscious recognition, suggesting that control becomes more effective as it becomes less apparent. The viewer encounters an image that appears open, minimal, or undefined, experiencing a sense of freedom that contrasts with more overtly structured compositions. Yet this experience is shaped by expectations that determine how such openness is interpreted. The absence of clear direction does not eliminate guidance, but shifts it into subtler forms, indicating that perception is influenced by frameworks that have been internalized through prior encounters with images, spaces, and cultural systems. The theoretical implications of this condition can be understood through the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose phenomenological analysis emphasizes that perception is not a passive reception of stimuli, but an embodied engagement shaped by prior experience, suggesting that the viewer brings a set of expectations to each encounter that influences how the visible is understood. Within this framework, control operates not through external imposition, but through the conditions that structure perception from within, indicating that the absence of visible structure does not produce freedom, but reveals the extent to which perception is already guided by internalized patterns. The emergence of minimalism in modern art provides a clear example of how control can operate without overt structure, as works reduce visual elements to simple forms that appear to offer little guidance, creating the impression that interpretation is entirely open. The sculptures of Donald Judd, such as Untitled, present repeated geometric units arranged in space, avoiding narrative, symbolism, or compositional hierarchy, suggesting that the viewer is free to engage with the work without direction. Yet the precise arrangement of these forms establishes relationships that guide perception, determining how the viewer experiences space, proportion, and repetition, indicating that control operates through the structuring of experience rather than through explicit instruction. The viewer may perceive openness, yet this openness is organized through conditions that shape how the work is encountered. The operation of control without visible structure is further evident in the light installations of James Turrell, where the manipulation of light creates environments that dissolve boundaries and remove traditional cues for spatial orientation. In works such as Afram, White, the viewer encounters a luminous form that appears to float within space, challenging the distinction between surface and depth, indicating that perception is guided through sensory conditions that operate beyond the level of conscious analysis. The absence of visible structure does not produce ambiguity alone, but shapes how the viewer interprets the space, suggesting that control operates through the manipulation of perception itself, rather than through the arrangement of identifiable elements. The concept of atmosphere provides a useful framework for understanding this condition, as it describes the way in which environments influence perception through qualities that are not reducible to specific forms or structures, indicating that control can operate through the overall experience of a space, rather than through its individual components. The installations of Olafur Eliasson, particularly works such as Room for One Color, demonstrate how the manipulation of light and color can transform perception, guiding the viewer's experience through conditions that affect how the world is seen. The viewer, entering such environments, experiences a shift in perception that appears immediate and unstructured. Yet this experience is carefully constructed, indicating that control operates through the shaping of sensory conditions, rather than through explicit visual organization. The absence of visible structure is also evident in traditional ink painting, where the use of empty space creates compositions that appear open and undefined, allowing the viewer to engage with the image through a process that seems unrestricted. In works such as Six Persimmons, the minimal arrangement of forms within a largely empty space suggests that the viewer is free to interpret the image without guidance, yet the placement of each element establishes relationships that shape how the composition is perceived, indicating that control operates through subtle adjustments that guide attention and balance. The viewer experiences the image as open, yet this openness is structured through principles that define how emptiness and presence interact. The role of absence in structuring perception can also be observed in Japanese aesthetics, particularly in the concept of ma, which emphasizes the importance of negative space as an active component of composition, suggesting that the absence of form can guide perception as effectively as its presence. The dry landscape garden of Ryoanji exemplifies this principle, as the arrangement of rocks within an expanse of raked gravel creates a composition that appears simple, yet directs the viewer's attention through relationships that determine how the space is experienced. The viewer perceives the garden as open and meditative, yet this perception is shaped by the precise placement of elements, indicating that control operates through minimal intervention that structures how the space is understood. The operation of control without visible structure extends into contemporary digital environments, where interfaces are designed to appear intuitive and natural, creating the impression that interaction is self-directed, while guiding behavior through subtle cues that shape how users navigate information. The absence of visible constraint does not produce freedom, but facilitates engagement within systems that determine how choices are made, suggesting that control operates through design strategies that align user behavior with the logic of the system. The viewer interacts with these environments as if exercising autonomy, yet their actions are shaped by structures that operate beneath the level of conscious awareness, indicating that control becomes more effective as it becomes less perceptible. The persistence of this condition across different cultural and historical contexts demonstrates that the absence of visible structure does not eliminate control, but transforms its operation, embedding it within the conditions that shape perception from within. The viewer encounters images and environments that appear open and unrestricted, yet this openness is structured through frameworks that guide interpretation, indicating that control operates through the alignment between perception and expectation. The experience of freedom emerges not from the absence of structure, but from its invisibility, suggesting that the act of seeing is always shaped by conditions that define how the visible is understood. The recognition of control without structure reveals that perception is guided by systems that do not rely on explicit forms, but operate through conditions that shape how the world is encountered, indicating that the viewer engages with images and environments through frameworks that have been internalized and normalized. The absence of visible direction does not produce neutrality, but introduces a form of control that is more difficult to detect, suggesting that the experience of freedom depends on the concealment of the structures that guide it. The act of seeing becomes an engagement with conditions that shaped perception from within, revealing that control persists even when it is no longer visible, ensuring that the viewer remains aligned with systems that determine how meaning is constructed. The perception of images often oscillates between two assumptions, one that recognizes the presence of structure, and another that imagines its absence, creating the impression that visual systems can either guide perception or dissolve entirely, allowing the viewer to encounter the image in a state of freedom unmediated by external frameworks. This oscillation depends on the belief that structure is something that can be removed, that control can be undone, and that perception can return to a condition of neutrality, in which meaning emerges directly from what is seen. Yet the persistence of systems across different forms of visual experience reveals that structure does not disappear, but transforms, adapting to new conditions while continuing to shape how images are encountered and understood, indicating that the act of seeing is always situated within frameworks that define how perception operates. The viewer does not move between structured and unstructured conditions, but between different forms of organization that guide interpretation in ways that vary in visibility and intensity, suggesting that the system is not an external imposition, but a fundamental condition of perception itself. The continuity of these systems can be understood through the recognition that perception depends on relations that organize how visual information is processed, indicating that the absence of one structure does not produce a void, but allows another to emerge, shaping how the image is encountered in ways that may be less apparent, but no less effective. The viewer, encountering works that appear to reject traditional forms of organization, engages with new systems that define how attention is directed, how meaning is constructed, and how interpretation unfolds over time, suggesting that the disappearance of structure is always provisional, as perception reorganizes itself through alternative frameworks that continue to guide the experience of seeing. This condition reveals that the system is not located within specific visual strategies, but within the processes that enable perception itself, indicating that structure persists as a condition that cannot be removed, but only transformed. The theoretical articulation of this persistence can be found in the work of Ernst Cassirer, whose concept of symbolic forms suggests that human understanding operates through systems that structure how the world is perceived and interpreted, indicating that meaning is always mediated through frameworks that define how experience is organized. Within this framework, images function as expressions of these systems, reflecting the conditions that shape perception, rather than existing independently of them, suggesting that the viewer engages with visual experience through structures that cannot be eliminated, but only reconfigured. The system persists, not as a fixed set of rules, but as a dynamic condition that adapts to different contexts while maintaining its role in shaping how meaning is constructed. The persistence of the system becomes evident when examining works that attempt to dissolve traditional forms of representation, as these works often generate new structures that guide perception in alternative ways. The paintings of Mark Rothko, for example, reduce visual elements to large fields of color that appear to eliminate composition, narrative, and symbolic reference, creating the impression of an open and unstructured space. Yet the arrangement of color, scale, and proportion establishes relationships that guide the viewer's attention and emotional response, indicating that the experience of openness is itself structured through conditions that shape how the work is encountered. The viewer perceives the painting as immersive and undefined, yet this perception is guided by the interaction between color and scale, suggesting that the system persists through the organization of elements that operate beyond traditional compositional strategies. The continuation of structural systems within abstraction can also be observed in the work of Agnes Martin, whose grids and subtle variations create images that appear minimal and repetitive, suggesting the absence of hierarchy or focal point, yet the precise alignment of lines and the modulation of tone establish a framework that guides perception, indicating that the viewer engages with the work through a system that organizes attention across the surface. The apparent neutrality of the grid conceals a structure that shapes how the image is experienced, suggesting that the system persists through patterns that define how perception unfolds. The persistence of the system is not limited to modern art, but can be traced across different cultural traditions, where attempts to create openness or ambiguity generate new forms of organization that guide perception. In Chinese ink painting, the use of empty space creates compositions that appear unstructured, yet the placement of forms establishes relationships that determine how the image is read, indicating that the absence of detail does not eliminate structure, but reconfigures it. The viewer engages with the image through patterns that define how emptiness and presence interact, suggesting that the system operates through balance and relation, rather than through explicit form. The continuity of structural systems is further evident in Islamic art, where the avoidance of figuration leads to the development of geometric and calligraphic patterns that create visual fields structured through repetition and variation, indicating that the system persists through the organization of elements that guide perception across the surface. The viewer experiences these patterns as continuous and expansive, yet this experience is shaped by relationships that determine how the eye moves and how the image is interpreted, suggesting that the system operates through the structuring of visual rhythm rather than through representational hierarchy. The persistence of the system becomes particularly evident in contemporary visual culture, where images are encountered within environments that are shaped by technological and institutional frameworks that determine how they are presented and interpreted. The viewer engages with images through interfaces that organize attention through layout, sequencing, and interaction, indicating that perception is guided by systems that extend beyond the image itself, suggesting that the system operates at multiple levels that shape how visual experience is constructed. The apparent freedom of navigation within these environments conceals structures that determine visibility and emphasis, indicating that the system persists through conditions that define how images are encountered. The work of Jacques Rancière provides a framework for understanding how these systems operate within what he describes as the distribution of the sensible, suggesting that perception is structured through arrangements that define what can be seen, said, and understood, indicating that the system operates as a condition that shapes how the visible is organized. Within this framework, attempts to disrupt or reconfigure perception do not eliminate the system but redistribute its elements, creating new conditions that define how images are encountered, suggesting that the persistence of the system lies in its capacity to adapt to different configurations while maintaining its role in structuring perception. The recognition that the system never disappears reveals that perception is always mediated through frameworks that define how the world is seen, indicating that the viewer cannot step outside of these systems but can become aware of their operation. The act of seeing becomes a process of engagement with structures that shape how images are interpreted, suggesting that the possibility of freedom lies not in the absence of structure, but in the ability to recognize and navigate the systems that define how perception operates. The persistence of the system across different forms of visual experience demonstrates that structure is not an optional component of perception, but a fundamental condition that enables meaning to be constructed, indicating that the disappearance of one system leads to the emergence of another that continues to guide interpretation. The viewer encounters images that appear to resist structure, yet this resistance generates new forms of organization that shape how the image is experienced, suggesting that the system operates through transformation rather than elimination. The system does not disappear because it is not located within specific forms, but within the processes that organize perception, ensuring that the act of seeing is always structured by conditions that define how the visible is understood. The viewer moves through different visual environments, encountering variations in how structure operates, yet remains within systems that guide attention, shape interpretation, and construct meaning, indicating that the persistence of the system is a condition that defines the nature of visual experience itself. The act of looking has never been a neutral encounter with the visible, even when it appears immediate, effortless, and self-directed, as if the world presents itself fully formed to perception, and the viewer simply receives what is already there, creating the impression that vision operates as a transparent medium through which reality is accessed without mediation. This impression persists because the systems that structure perception are internalized to such a degree that they disappear into the act of seeing itself, allowing the viewer to experience recognition, judgment, and interpretation as spontaneous, while relying on frameworks that determine how visual information is organized and understood. The eye does not function as an independent instrument, but as part of a network of relations that shape how attention is directed, how forms are recognized, and how meaning is constructed, indicating that the experience of looking is always situated within systems that guide perception while concealing their own operation. The journey through images across different periods, cultures, and media reveals that what appears as variation in style, form, and content reflects deeper continuities in how perception is structured, suggesting that the diversity of visual expression does not eliminate the presence of underlying systems, but demonstrates their adaptability. The sculptural ideals of ancient Greece, the philosophical landscapes of China, the geometric orders of Islamic art, the perspectival constructions of the Renaissance, the fragmentation of modernity, and the immersive environments of contemporary practice, each present different configurations of visual organization, yet all operate through structures that guide how the viewer engages with the image. These structures do not impose meaning in a direct or coercive manner, but shape the conditions under which meaning emerges, indicating that perception is not an open field but a constructed space in which attention, interpretation, and expectation are aligned through systems that define how the visible is encountered. The recognition that perception is structured does not diminish the experience of seeing, but transforms it, revealing that what appears natural is the result of processes that have been learned, repeated, and internalized over time, suggesting that the viewer participates in systems that extend beyond individual intention. The eye moves across the image, following paths that have been embedded within its composition, drawn by contrasts, guided by lines, and stabilized by focal points that determine how attention is distributed, indicating that movement is not random, but structured. The viewer experiences this movement as choice, yet it unfolds within conditions that shape how options are perceived and selected, suggesting that the illusion of freedom emerges from the alignment between perceived agency and structured guidance. The operation of symbols further demonstrates that meaning is not inherent in what is seen, but constructed through systems that assign significance to visual elements, indicating that interpretation depends on frameworks that define how images are read. The viewer encounters symbols as if their meaning was self-evident, yet this recognition relies on knowledge that has been acquired through cultural and historical processes, suggesting that perception operates within systems that connect the visible to broader conceptual structures. The image does not simply present, but instructs, guiding thought through the arrangement of elements that direct interpretation towards specific meanings, while preserving the appearance of openness. The role of the ideal in shaping expectation reveals that perception is oriented towards standards that define how the visible should appear, indicating that the viewer evaluates images according to criteria that have been established prior to the act of looking. These ideals operate across different contexts, whether through proportion, harmony, balance, or abstraction, shaping how forms are understood and how they are judged, suggesting that expectation functions as a mechanism that aligns perception with models that determine how the world is seen. The viewer does not approach the image without reference, but engages with it through frameworks that define what is considered correct, meaningful, or significant, indicating that perception is guided by systems that shape how the visible is evaluated. The attempt to break control reveals that these systems are not immutable, but can be challenged, disrupted, and reconfigured, suggesting that the structures that guide perception are not fixed, but subject to transformation. Artists who fragment perspective, destabilize meaning, or remove recognizable forms expose the conditions that structure perception, creating moments in which the viewer becomes aware of the frameworks that guide interpretation. Yet even within these disruptions, new systems emerge, indicating that the absence of one structure leads to the formation of another, suggesting that perception cannot exist without organization, but can only shift between different forms of it. The emergence of control without visible structure further demonstrates that the most effective systems are those that operate without appearing as systems, shaping perception through conditions that influence how the world is experienced without presenting themselves as constraints. The viewer encounters images and environments that appear open, minimal, or undefined, experiencing a sense of freedom that contrasts with more overtly structured forms. Yet this experience is guided by expectations that determine how such openness is interpreted. The absence of visible direction does not eliminate guidance, but relocates it within the processes of perception itself, indicating that control becomes more effective as it becomes less perceptible. The persistence of the system across all forms of visual experience reveals that structure is not an optional feature that can be removed, but a fundamental condition that defines how perception operates, suggesting that the act of seeing is always mediated by frameworks that shape how the visible is encountered. The viewer moves through images, spaces, and environments that appear to offer freedom, yet this movement unfolds within systems that guide attention, shape interpretation, and construct meaning, indicating that the system never disappears but transforms, adapting to new conditions while maintaining its role in structuring perception. To recognize that you were never just looking is to understand that perception is not a passive encounter with the world, but an engagement with systems that define how the world appears, indicating that the act of seeing involves participation in structures that shape how meaning is constructed. The image is not an object that exists independently of the viewer, but a field in which perception and structure interact, suggesting that the experience of looking is produced through the alignment between the viewer and the systems that guide interpretation. This recognition does not remove the influence of these systems, but makes them visible, allowing the viewer to engage with images in a way that acknowledges the conditions that shape how they are seen. The possibility of freedom does not lie in escaping these systems, but in becoming aware of them, recognizing that perception operates within frameworks that can be examined, questioned, and reinterpreted. The viewer cannot step outside of structure, but can engage with it critically, understanding that the act of seeing is shaped by relations that define how the visible is organized and how meaning is produced. This awareness transforms the experience of looking from an unconscious response into a reflective activity, suggesting that the act of seeing can become a process of inquiry rather than acceptance. You move through the museum, through images, through spaces that appear to offer stillness and clarity. Yet this stillness is constructed, this clarity is shaped, and this experience is guided by systems that define how perception unfolds. The quietness of the gallery does not imply neutrality, but conceals the conditions that organize how attention is directed and how meaning is formed, indicating that the environment itself participates in shaping how the viewer sees. The return to movement, to the presence of others, to the world beyond the controlled space of the museum, does not remove these systems but extends them, suggesting that the structures that guide perception remain active beyond the boundaries of the image. The act of looking continues, shaped by systems that have been internalized, repeated, and reinforced, indicating that perception operates within conditions that persist, even when they are not recognized. The viewer carries these frameworks into every encounter with the visible, suggesting that the experience of seeing is always mediated by relations that define how the world is understood. The image does not end when it is left behind, as its structures remain embedded within perception, shaping how future encounters are experienced. You are never just looking, because looking has always been an interaction with systems that guide how the world appears, shaping attention, structuring interpretation, and constructing meaning in ways that operate beyond conscious awareness. The recognition of this condition does not diminish the experience of seeing, but reveals its complexity, suggesting that the act of looking is not a simple encounter with the visible, but a process shaped by structures that define how perception operates. The image is not simply seen, but engaged, not simply encountered, but interpreted, indicating that the act of looking is always more than it appears, shaped by systems that guide how the world is seen and understood. The lights begin to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, and the stillness that held everything in place starts to loosen. The museum is no longer entirely yours. Footsteps return, distant at first, then closer, and the quiet that once allowed everything to unfold now begins to recede. What felt suspended returns to motion. What felt invisible begins to settle back into the familiar. The doors are opening again. You step away, but the way you see does not return unchanged.